Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in Brown County State Park, Indiana, deep in the Yellowwood State Forest where the ancient hills roll like sleeping giants and the trees grow so thick they swallow sound itself. David Jones had been my best friend since college, and when he suggested we take a long weekend to go backpacking in the most remote section of the park, I jumped at the chance. We both needed to get away from our desk jobs in Indianapolis, to breathe air that wasn't recycled through office vents, to remember what silence actually sounded like. David had researched this particular trail, an unmarked path that branched off from the official Tecumseh Trail near the fire tower on Weed Patch Hill. According to his research, it led to an abandoned ranger station from the 1940s, a place where we could camp without seeing another soul for miles. "It'll be perfect, Mike," David had said, spreading a topographic map across my kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. His finger traced a thin dotted line that disappeared into green shading. "Look here, Raccoon Ridge. The old station is right here, about 8 miles in. No cell towers, no road noise, nothing but wilderness." David was the outdoorsy one between us. While I played video games, he studied survival techniques. While I ordered takeout, he practiced fire starting with flint and steel. He had short-cropped brown hair, always wore his grandfather's military surplus jacket, and possessed an infectious enthusiasm for anything involving sleeping bags and freeze-dried food. I was taller, softer around the edges, and honestly preferred my adventures to come with room service. But David's excitement was contagious. We set out early on a Friday morning in October, when the maples were bleeding crimson and the oaks had turned the color of old bronze. The temperature hovered around 45 degrees, perfect hiking weather. David drove his Jeep to the trailhead near the fire tower where we shouldered our packs and set off into the forest that stretched unbroken toward the horizon. The first few hours were everything we'd hoped for. The marked trail wound through stands of tulip poplar and black walnut, past limestone outcroppings where water trickled down moss-covered faces. We saw a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, heard the hollow drumming of a pileated woodpecker echoing through the trees. David was in his element, pointing out animal tracks in the mud, identifying bird calls, stopping every few minutes to check our position on his GPS unit. "Look at this," he said around noon, kneeling beside a fallen log. "Fresh deer scrape. Big buck, judging by the size of these hoof prints." He stood and brushed soil from his hands. "We're getting into some serious wilderness now." That was when we reached the junction where the unofficial trail branched off toward Raccoon Ridge. The path wasn't much, barely wider than a deer trail, marked only by faded orange blazes on occasional trees. But David's GPS showed we were on course, and his map indicated the old ranger station lay 6 miles ahead through the heart of the forest. We turned onto the narrow trail, and within minutes the woods seemed to close around us like a living thing. The canopy overhead grew thicker, filtering the afternoon light into a greenish twilight. The familiar sounds of the forest, bird songs, rustling leaves, the distant hum of insects, gradually faded until we were walking through an almost oppressive silence. "It's quiet," I said, more to hear my own voice than because I had anything meaningful to say. David nodded, but he looked pleased rather than concerned. "That's what we came for, right? Real wilderness. No human noise pollution." By 3 o'clock, we'd been hiking for 6 hours and should have covered at least 12 miles. But David's GPS kept showing strange readings. One moment, we'd be right on track. The next, the little arrow would spin wildly before settling on a completely different bearing. He stopped to check the device, frowning at the screen. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the GPS with his finger. "It keeps losing signal, then picking up again with different coordinates." "Maybe the trees are too thick," I suggested, though something cold was starting to form in my stomach. The silence around us felt wrong now. not peaceful but expectant, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We pressed on, following the faint orange blazes that appeared just often enough to keep us on what we hoped was the right path. But as the afternoon wore on, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. We kept passing the same landmarks. A distinctive lightning-struck oak, a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a creek crossing where someone had left a cairn of stacked stones. "David," I said the third time we approached the lightning-struck oak. "Haven't we been here before?" He stopped so abruptly I almost walked into him. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at the GPS screen with an expression I'd never seen before. Confusion mixed with something that might have been fear. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The GPS shows we've been walking southeast for the past 2 hours. We should be getting close to the station." He looked up at the familiar twisted trunk of the lightning-struck tree. "But this is definitely the same tree." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. I pulled my jacket tighter and noticed that my hands were shaking. Maybe we should head back. Try again tomorrow with fresh batteries for the GPS. But David shook his head, his jaw set in the stubborn expression I knew so well. "No way. I planned this trip for months. There has to be a logical explanation." He held up the GPS, turning in a slow circle. "Look, it's working fine now. Says we're 3 miles from the station, bearing southwest." Southwest? We'd been walking southeast. Something was very wrong with either the GPS or the trail itself. But David was already moving again, following the orange blazes deeper into the woods. I had no choice but to follow, though every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around and run. The trees grew larger as we walked, old-growth giants that must have been standing when settlers first crossed these hills. Their trunks were easily 6 feet in diameter, their lowest branches lost in the shadows overhead. The underbrush thinned out beneath them, creating an almost cathedral-like space where our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being thrown back at us from impossible distances. Around 5 o'clock, just as the light was beginning to fail, we finally reached the old ranger station. It stood in a clearing that felt like a wound in the forest, a small log building with a green metal roof and windows that had been boarded over with plywood. The structure looked sound enough, though tall grass grew right up to the foundation and saplings had sprouted in the gutters. A rusted fire tower rose behind it, its metal framework dark against the dying sky. "Perfect," David said, dropping his pack with obvious relief. "Just like the pictures online." I set down my own pack and looked around the clearing. Something felt off about the place, though I couldn't put my finger on what. The grass was too uniform, like it had been mowed, but that was impossible this far from civilization. The tree line around the clearing formed an almost perfect circle, as if someone had planned it that way. And there was that silence again, so complete it made my ears ring. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark," David said, already pulling tent stakes from his pack. "I want to get a fire going and cook those steaks I brought." We pitched our tents on what had once been the station's front yard, a relatively flat area where the grass was shorter and the ground felt solid. David insisted on setting up his tent about 30 feet from mine, claiming he needed space to spread out his gear. I would have preferred to camp closer together, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. As we worked, I kept glancing at the boarded windows of the ranger station. The plywood looked newer than it should have, as if someone had been maintaining the building more recently than the 1940s, and there were scratches in the wood around the doorframe, long, parallel gouges that looked almost like claw marks, though they were far too large to have been made by any animal I knew. "David," I said as he struggled to get his camp stove lit, "look at those scratches on the door." He glanced over, then shrugged. "Probably a bear. They like to mark territory by clawing trees and buildings." The stove finally caught with a blue whoosh of flame. "Nothing to worry about. Bears avoid humans." But those scratches bothered me. They were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, and they were deep, deeper than any bear claw should have been able to cut into seasoned hardwood. Night fell faster than it should have, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sky. One moment we could still see the tree line clearly. The next, we were sitting in a bubble of firelight surrounded by impenetrable darkness. David had managed to get a good fire going in a ring of stones someone had left behind, and the flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing. "This is the life," David said, settling back against his pack with a satisfied sigh. He'd cooked both our steaks to perfection, and we'd shared a bottle of bourbon he'd smuggled in despite the park's alcohol restrictions. No schedules, no emails, no traffic, just us and the wilderness. I nodded and tried to share his enthusiasm, but something was wrong with the darkness beyond our fire. It seemed too solid, too present, as if it was actively pushing against the light. And there were sounds coming from the forest. Not the normal night sounds of owls and insects, but something else. A rhythmic rustling, like something large moving through the underbrush in a deliberate pattern, circling our camp. "Do you hear that?" I asked, leaning forward to listen more carefully. David cocked his head, then shook it. "Hear what?" "The wind." But there was no wind. The air was completely still, so still that the smoke from our fire rose straight up like a gray pillar. Yet the rustling continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there at the edge of hearing. "Maybe we should keep the fire burning all night," I suggested. David laughed. "What are you, afraid of the dark? We've got enough wood for maybe 3 hours. After that, we'll just have to trust our sleeping bags to keep us warm." The idea of sleeping in complete darkness in this place made my stomach clench with dread. I'd never been afraid of the dark before, not since childhood, but something about this particular darkness felt hungry, patient, alive. It was waiting for our fire to die so it could move closer, investigate what we were, decide what to do with us. Around 11 o'clock, David started yawning. "I'm beat," he said, stretching and climbing to his feet. "All that hiking, plus the bourbon, I'm going to sleep like a baby." "You sure we shouldn't take turns keeping watch?" I asked. "Just in case?" "In case of what?" "We're in a state park, Mike, not the African savannah." He kicked dirt over the dying embers of our fire. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll explore that fire tower, maybe hike to the ridge and see if we can spot any wildlife." He disappeared into his tent, and within minutes I could hear him snoring softly. I sat alone in the darkness, listening to the sounds from the forest that David somehow couldn't hear. The rustling had stopped, but now there was something else. A low humming, almost below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to come from the ground itself. I retreated to my own tent and crawled into my sleeping bag fully clothed, but sleep was impossible. Every few minutes I heard footsteps outside, soft, careful steps that circled the clearing with the patience of a predator. When I worked up the courage to peer through my tent's mesh window, I saw nothing but darkness so complete it hurt to look at. Sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off because I was awakened by the sound of David's tent zipper being pulled down. I lay still, listening as he rustled around inside his tent, then heard his footsteps moving away across the clearing. "David?" I called softly but got no answer. I waited 10 minutes, then unzipped my own tent and stepped outside. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but I could hear David moving around somewhere near the ranger station, his footsteps echoing strangely in the still air. "David, what are you doing?" I called, louder this time. His footsteps stopped. Then, from somewhere near the boarded-up building, I heard his voice. "Just checking something out. Go back to sleep." Something about his voice bothered me, though I couldn't identify what. It sounded like David, but there was a flatness to it, as if he was speaking without emotion. And there was an echo, as if his words were coming from inside the building rather than outside it. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and tried to convince myself everything was normal, but I could still hear him moving around out there. Footsteps that seemed to wander aimlessly around the clearing, pausing for long minutes before resuming in a different direction. The sounds continued until dawn, till I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and emerged from my tent to find David cooking breakfast over a rebuilt fire. He looked perfectly normal, even cheerful, but something felt different about him. He was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, but they looked freshly pressed. His hair was combed, though we'd been camping for 2 days without a mirror or bathroom. And when he smiled at me, the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said, flipping bacon in his camp skillet. "Sleep well?" "Not really," I admitted. "I heard you moving around outside most of the night. What were you doing?" David paused with the spatula halfway to the pan. For just a moment, his smile faltered and something cold flickered across his face. Then the expression returned, bright and cheerful. "Don't know what you mean," he said. "I slept like a rock. Must have been dreaming." But I knew what I'd heard, and looking at him now, I noticed other things that were wrong. His eyes didn't blink as often as they should. When he handed me a plate of food, his fingers were ice cold despite standing over the fire. And there was a smell about him. Not exactly unpleasant, but strange, like ozone after a lightning strike. "I think we should head back today," I said, picking at my breakfast. The bacon tasted like ash in my mouth. "I'm not feeling great." "Nonsense," David said quickly. "We just got here. I want to explore that fire tower, maybe climb to the top and get some pictures. The view must be incredible from up there." I looked at the rusty tower rising behind the ranger station. Some of the metal rungs were missing, and the platform at the top swayed visibly in the breeze that hadn't existed during the night. It looked like a death trap. "I don't think that's safe," I said. "Come on, Mike, live a little." David's smile grew wider, showing too many teeth. "What's the worst that could happen?" After breakfast, David insisted on exploring the ranger station itself. The door was secured with a modern padlock, but he produced a crowbar from his pack, something I'd never seen him carry before, and had it open in minutes. "David, this is breaking and entering," I protested as he pushed the door open. "We could get arrested." "Who's going to know?" he asked, and again there was that flat tone to his voice as if he was repeating words without understanding their meaning. "There's no one around for miles." The interior of the station was a single room with a pot-bellied stove, a wooden desk, and metal filing cabinets against one wall. Everything was covered in a layer of dust that seemed too thick for a building that had been abandoned for only a few decades. But what caught my attention immediately were the scratches. They were everywhere, on the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Long, parallel gouges like the ones I'd seen on the doorframe, but these were deeper, more frantic. They covered every surface in overlapping patterns that hurt to look at, as if someone or something had been trapped inside and had clawed desperately at every surface trying to get out. "Jesus," I whispered, running my fingers along one set of scratches that scored the wooden wall from floor to ceiling. "What the hell happened here?" David didn't answer. He was standing at the desk, reading something in a faded manila folder. His face was completely expressionless, but I could see his lips moving silently as if he was memorizing whatever was written there. "David, what is that?" He looked up, and for just a moment I saw something terrible in his eyes. A vast, hungry intelligence that had nothing to do with my friend. Then he blinked and was David again, or something wearing David's face. "Just old ranger reports," he said, closing the folder. "Nothing interesting. Ready to check out that tower." I wanted to run. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from this place, away from whatever was wearing David's face. But my car keys were in David's pack, and we were 8 miles from the nearest road through country I didn't know. I had no choice but to follow him outside and watch as he began climbing the rusty ladder of the fire tower. "Be careful," I called up to him, though part of me hoped he would fall and break whatever spell or possession had taken hold of him. He climbed with inhuman speed and grace, never hesitating despite the missing rungs and corroded metal. When he reached the platform at the top, he stood at the railing and waved down at me, grinning that too-wide smile. "The view is amazing," he shouted. "You can see for miles. Come up." I began climbing reluctantly, testing each rung before putting my full weight on it. About halfway up, I made the mistake of looking down and immediately regretted it. The ground seemed impossibly far away, and I had a sudden, vivid image of myself falling, my body breaking against the earth while David watched with that empty smile. When I reached the platform, I found David standing at the far railing, staring out into the forest with an expression of intense concentration. The view was indeed spectacular, an unbroken canopy of autumn colors stretching to the horizon in every direction. But something was wrong with the landscape below us. The trees formed patterns, not the random growth of a natural forest, but deliberate spirals and geometric shapes that were invisible from ground level. And in the center of each pattern was a clearing, dark circles in the canopy that looked like wounds in the earth. "Beautiful, isn't it?" David said without turning around. "So much more than it appears from below." I counted 12 clearings visible from our vantage point, each one perfectly circular, each one containing what looked like structures, more ranger stations, or maybe something older. They were arranged in a pattern that made my eyes water to follow, connected by lines that weren't quite roads and weren't quite trails. "David, we need to get out of here," I said, backing toward the ladder. "Something's seriously wrong with this place." He turned then, and I saw that his face had changed. His features were the same, but they sat wrong, as if someone had rearranged them slightly. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes reflected the light like an animal's. "Wrong?" he asked, tilting his head at an angle that was too sharp, too far. "What could be wrong? We're exactly where we're supposed to be, Mike, where we've always been supposed to be." I lunged for the ladder, but he moved faster than any human should have been able to move. His hand clamped around my wrist with strength that made bones creak, and I found myself staring into eyes that held no recognition, no memory of our friendship. "You can't leave yet," he said in a voice that sounded like David's but carried harmonics that hurt my ears. "The others want to meet you." "Others?" As if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from the tree line around the clearing. At first glance, they looked human, men and women in hiking clothes, some carrying backpacks. But as they drew closer, I could see that something was wrong with each of them. One woman walked with a gait that was too fluid, as if her joints bent in places they shouldn't. A man in a red flannel shirt had arms that hung too long at his sides, his knuckles nearly dragging on the ground. Another figure seemed to flicker between shapes, sometimes human, sometimes something with too many limbs. They arranged themselves in a circle around the base of the tower and looked up at us with faces that were almost right, but not quite. Faces that might have belonged to hikers and campers who had taken this trail over the years, people who had found the ranger station and discovered they couldn't leave. "Welcome," they called in unison, their voices blending into a harmony that made my teeth ache. "Welcome to the family." David, or the thing wearing David's face, smiled down at them with obvious affection. "He's almost ready," he called back. "Just needs a little more time to adjust." My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was seeing. These weren't people anymore, if they ever had been. They were something else, something that had taken human shapes but hadn't quite mastered the art of wearing them convincingly. And they wanted to do the same thing to me. I jerked my arm free from David's grip and scrambled down the ladder so fast I barely felt the rungs under my feet. Behind me, I heard David laugh, a sound like breaking glass, but he didn't try to follow. The figures in the clearing parted to let me pass, reaching out with fingers that were too long, too jointed, but not quite touching me. Not yet. I ran for my tent, planning to grab my pack and flee into the forest. But when I got there, I found my sleeping bag empty and unzipped from the inside. My pack was gone. Even my clothes had vanished, leaving only the tent itself and the cold metal of my car keys, which I found lying in the center of the tent floor like an offering. David's Jeep was still parked where we'd left it at the trailhead, assuming I could find my way back to the trailhead. But my GPS was in my missing pack and David's was still with him up on the tower. I had nothing but the keys and a rapidly fading memory of the route we'd taken to get here. I pocketed the keys and started running. The trail seemed different in daylight, the orange blazes harder to spot, the path itself more overgrown. Several times I found myself in clearings I didn't remember passing, staring at structures that couldn't have been there yesterday. More ranger stations, all boarded up, all bearing those same deep scratches around their doors and windows. Behind me, I could hear voices calling my name. Not just David's voice, but others, a whole chorus of them getting closer. When I looked back, I could see them following me through the trees, moving in that too fluid way, their shapes flickering between human and something else. The trail branched and branched again, each fork taking me deeper into country that looked less and less familiar. The trees grew larger, older, until I was running through a forest that seemed primordial, untouched by human hands. The very air felt thick and strange, as if I was breathing something other than oxygen. Just as panic was really beginning to set in, I stumbled onto a wider trail, the official Tecumseh Trail, marked with the familiar white blazes of the state park system. I could have wept with relief as I turned toward what I hoped was the direction of the parking area. The voices behind me had faded, though I could still feel eyes watching from the shadows between the trees. Whatever those things were, they seemed reluctant to follow me onto the marked trail. Maybe they were bound to their own territory, limited to the spaces between the official paths. I reached David's Jeep just as the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but the engine turned over on the first try. I reversed out of the parking space and headed for the main road, not caring that I was abandoning David to whatever fate awaited him in that place. Because the thing I'd left behind wasn't David anymore. David was gone, and something else was wearing his face, walking around in his body, using his voice to lure other victims into the woods. I drove straight to the Brown County Sheriff's Department and tried to file a missing person report, but the deputy who took my statement looked at me like I was drunk or delusional. "Let me get this straight," he said, reading from his notes. "Your friend David Jones went missing from an unmarked trail near Raccoon Ridge, but you say he's not actually missing. He's been replaced by some kind of shapeshifter." "I know how it sounds," I said, "but something happened to him out there. Something changed him." The deputy, his nameplate read Kowalski, leaned back in his chair and studied me with tired eyes. "Sir, I've been working these woods for 15 years. Brown County State Park is one of the safest recreational areas in Indiana. The worst thing that happens out there is the occasional sprained ankle or bear sighting." "What about Raccoon Ridge?" I asked. "What about the old ranger stations?" Kowalski frowned. "There's no place called Raccoon Ridge in Brown County, and there's definitely no old ranger stations. The park wasn't established until 1929, and all the facilities have been accounted for since day one." He pulled out a detailed map of the park and spread it across his desk. "Show me exactly where you think you went." I studied the map carefully, looking for the trail David had marked, the fire tower, the clearing where we'd camped. But none of it was there. According to the official park map, the area where we'd spent 2 days simply didn't exist. "That's impossible," I whispered. "We were there. I saw it." Kowalski folded up the map with a sympathetic expression. "Look, Mr. Williams, you've obviously been through some kind of trauma. Maybe you and your friend got separated. Maybe you hit your head. Maybe you got turned around and confused. It happens to experienced hikers all the time. Why don't you give me your friend's contact information, and I'll give him a call. I bet you'll find he's sitting at home wondering where you went." I gave him David's phone number, though I knew it wouldn't help. Kowalski dialed and waited, then shook his head. "Goes straight to voicemail. Phone's probably dead." He handed me a business card. "Go home, get some rest, eat a decent meal. If your friend doesn't turn up in 24 hours, come back and we'll file an official report." I drove back to Indianapolis in a daze, unable to process what had happened. Either I was losing my mind, or I'd stumbled into something that existed outside the normal world, something that left no trace on official maps or in public records. At home, I tried calling David's number myself, but like the deputy had said, It went straight to voicemail. I left a message, knowing he would never hear it, then sat in my apartment and tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of elaborate hallucination. But 3 days later, David called me back. "Mike!" His voice was bright and cheerful, exactly like the old David. "I've been trying to reach you for days. What happened? 1 minute we were setting up camp, the next you were gone. I was worried sick." My blood turned to ice water. "David, where are you?" "Home. Of course. I waited around the camp for hours hoping you'd come back, then hiked out Sunday morning when I couldn't find you. I've been calling and calling." "What camp?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Brown County, remember? That place near Raccoon Ridge we talked about? The old ranger station. We had such a great time until you disappeared." I hung up and immediately called the phone company to check David's call records. According to them, the call had originated from a cell tower in Brown County State Park, somewhere in the area marked on my map as undeveloped wilderness. David kept calling. Every few days, sometimes every few hours. The voice was always perfectly his, the tone always concerned and friendly. He wanted to know why I wasn't returning his calls. He was worried about me. He missed our friendship. But each time we talked, he would mention details that were wrong. He would reference conversations we'd never had, describe events that had never happened, ask about people who didn't exist. It was as if something was trying to reconstruct David's personality from incomplete information, filling in the gaps with guesswork. The worst part was how convincing it sounded. Sometimes, in the middle of one of these conversations, I would almost believe it really was David, that everything that happened in the woods had been some kind of stress-induced breakdown. But then he would say something that didn't quite fit, or laugh in a way that made my skin crawl, and I would remember the thing with his face that had gripped my wrist on top of the fire tower. I changed my phone number twice, but somehow the calls kept coming. I considered moving to another state, starting fresh somewhere far from Indiana and its impossible forests. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was out there had tasted something about me, marked me in some way. Distance wouldn't matter. Distance. So I learned to live with it. I got a new job, made new friends, tried to build a normal life. But every few weeks my phone would ring, and David's voice would ask why I wasn't returning his calls, why I had abandoned him in the woods when I was coming back to visit. Because that's what it wanted, eventually, for me to come back. "I miss you, Mike," David's voice said during the most recent call just 2 days ago. "It's lonely out here without you. The others keep asking when you're going to join us." "I'm not coming back," I told him, as I had told him dozens of times before. "You will," he said with absolute certainty. "Eventually, you'll get curious. You'll want to know what really happened out there. You'll want to see if I'm really David or something else. And when you do, we'll be waiting." The line went dead, but I could still hear his laughter echoing in my head. That was 2 days ago. Since then, I've been having dreams about the fire tower, about the clearing where impossible patterns hide in the canopy. In my dreams, I'm climbing the rusty ladder again, drawn by David's voice calling from above. But this time, when I reach the platform, there are dozens of figures waiting for me. All the hikers and campers who took the wrong trail over the years, all wearing faces that are almost human but not quite. I wake up with the taste of ozone in my mouth and scratches on my arms that weren't there when I went to sleep. They're getting longer each night, deeper. I think my time is running out. This morning, I found orange blazes painted on the trees outside my apartment building. Fresh paint, still wet, marking a trail that leads deeper into the city. When I followed them for a few blocks, they led to an alley that ended in solid brick wall, but I could swear I heard David's voice calling from somewhere beyond it. I know what's happening. The boundary between their world and ours is breaking down. Or maybe they're learning to extend their reach beyond the deep woods. Either way, they're coming for me. So I'm writing this down, leaving a record of what happened in Brown County State Park in a place that doesn't officially exist. If you're reading this, it means they finally got me, dragged me back to that clearing where the trees form impossible patterns and the ranger stations house things that wear human faces. Don't go looking for me. Don't try to verify my story or find the trail to Raccoon Ridge. There are some places that exist only when they want to be found, and some hungers that can never be satisfied. And if someone who claims to be Michael Williams ever calls you, asking for help, asking you to come find him in the woods, hang up the phone, because it won't be me anymore. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote depths of Hoosier National Forest, Indiana, near the abandoned settlement of Hickory Ridge, where the trees grow so thick that even noon feels like twilight. I should have listened to the park ranger who warned me about the old logging trails. Should have paid attention when he mentioned the missing hikers from last autumn, his weathered face growing pale as he spoke of the bad feelings that hung over the deeper woods like a shroud. But I was stubborn, desperate for solitude after the divorce, and Ranger Mackenzie's superstitions seemed like small-town nonsense to someone who'd spent her whole life in Indianapolis. My German shepherd, Diesel, had been my constant companion through the worst months of my life. When Marcus left, taking half our savings and all our mutual friends, Diesel remained loyal. His amber eyes held no judgment, only unconditional love. The plan was simple: a week-long camping trip to clear my head and decide what came next. Just me, Diesel, and the wilderness. The first sign something was wrong came on our second day, deep in the Charles C. Deem Wilderness area. I'd hiked the Grub Ridge Trail before, but never this far from the main campground. The map showed an old fire tower about 6 miles in, and I decided to make camp nearby, away from the weekend warriors who cluttered the more accessible sites. Diesel had been acting strange since we'd crossed Bean Blossom Creek. His ears stayed pinned back, and he kept looking over his shoulder, whimpering softly. I assumed it was the unfamiliar territory making him nervous. Dogs could sense things humans missed. Maybe there was a bear nearby, or coyotes marking territory. The forest felt different here. Older. The hiking trail petered out after the 3rd mile, leaving only deer paths and the occasional blaze mark on dying trees. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their gnarled branches blocking most of the sunlight. Everything smelled of decay and damp earth, like a basement that hadn't seen air in decades. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near what my GPS showed as Hickory Ravine. The fire tower wasn't visible, but I could feel its presence somewhere in the gloom ahead. I set up camp quickly, wanting to have everything secured before dark. Diesel stayed close, practically glued to my leg as I assembled the tent. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. His tail wagged half-heartedly, but his eyes kept scanning the tree line. "Just some new smells, right? We're okay." I was wrong. The first night passed without incident, though I slept poorly. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me bolt upright in my sleeping bag. Diesel seemed even worse, spending most of the night sitting at the tent entrance, ears pricked and alert. Twice I heard him growl, a low, rumbling sound that raised the hair on my arms. Morning brought relief and embarrassment. In daylight, the forest seemed perfectly normal. Birds chirped in the canopy, squirrels chattered from their perches, and Diesel was back to his usual energetic self, tail wagging as he investigated interesting scents around our campsite. I decided to hike to the fire tower, leaving most of our gear behind. It was a gorgeous October day, with just enough chill to make the hiking pleasant. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely peaceful. The trail to the tower was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and fallen logs. According to my research, the structure had been abandoned in the 1970s, left to rust after new detection methods made it obsolete. Local legends claimed it was haunted, but then again, locals claimed a lot of things about these woods. We found the tower after 2 hours of bushwhacking. It rose from a small clearing like a metal skeleton, its steel framework brown with rust and decay. Stairs spiraled up the outside, but several were missing, and the entire structure swayed ominously in the breeze. A small cabin sat at the base, its windows broken and door hanging open. Diesel refused to approach the cabin. He planted himself at the edge of the clearing and wouldn't budge, despite my coaxing. When I tried to pull him forward, he dug in his heels and whined pitifully. "Fine," I said, dropping his leash. "Stay there. I'll just peek inside." The cabin was a disaster. Vandals had torn apart the interior, leaving graffiti on the walls and trash scattered across the floor. But there was something else, a smell that made my stomach turn. Sweet and cloying, like meat left too long in the sun. I covered my nose with my shirt and stepped carefully through the debris. In the back corner, partially hidden by an overturned desk, I found the source of the smell. A deer carcass, or what remained of one. The bones had been picked clean, but they were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like a ritual circle. Some of the bones showed cut marks, clean and precise, made by something sharp, human-made, not animal teeth. I backed out of the cabin quickly, my heart racing. Hunters sometimes cleaned their kills in remote locations, but this felt different, wrong. The bones were too carefully arranged, and there was something else. Symbols carved into the cabin's back wall, crude but deliberate marks that looked almost like writing. "Come on, Diesel," I called, trying to keep my voice casual. "Let's head back." He seemed as eager to leave as I was, practically dragging me away from the clearing. We made good time returning to camp, but the afternoon felt colder somehow, the shadows deeper and more threatening. That evening, I built a larger fire than necessary, feeding it constantly to keep the flames high. Diesel lay beside me, but his relaxed demeanor from the morning was gone. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head and stare into the darkness beyond our small circle of light. "Just animals," I told him, and myself. Maybe a raccoon family. But I knew it wasn't raccoons. The forest had gone completely silent. No nightbirds, no insects, nothing but the crackle of burning wood and the sound of my own breathing. Even the wind had died, leaving the trees motionless and watchful. Around midnight, Diesel suddenly stood and walked to the edge of our campsite. His hackles rose and that low growl started in his throat again. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, but saw nothing except dancing shadows. "What is it, boy?" The growling stopped abruptly. Diesel tilted his head, listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he walked into the darkness. "Diesel!" I called sharply. "Come back here." He paused just at the edge of my flashlight beam, looking back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes reflected the light, but there was something vacant in them, like he was sleepwalking. Then he turned and continued into the forest. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and followed, calling his name. The makeshift torch provided only a small circle of light, and the darkness seemed to press against it from all sides. I could hear Diesel's collar jingling somewhere ahead, but the sound kept moving, always just out of reach. "Diesel, here, boy, come." The jingling stopped. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear anything that might indicate his location. My torch was burning down, and I was starting to panic. How far had I come from camp? The trees all looked the same in the wavering light, and I couldn't see my fire anymore. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, raising the torch, and nearly screamed. Diesel stood 10 feet away, perfectly still, watching me. Relief flooded through me until I noticed his posture. He stood ramrod straight, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, like someone had positioned him there. "Diesel? Here, boy." He didn't move, didn't wag his tail or show any sign of recognition. Just stared at me with those empty, reflecting eyes. I took a step forward, and he took a step back, maintaining the exact same distance between us. My torch flickered and dimmed, and in the brief moment of near darkness I could have sworn I saw something else standing behind Diesel. Something tall and impossibly thin, with 2 long arms that hung down past its knees. The torch flared again, and Diesel was alone. Normal. He trotted over to me, tail wagging, and nuzzled my free hand like nothing had happened. "Jesus, Diesel," I whispered, my hands shaking as I petted him. "Don't ever do that again." Getting back to camp took 20 terrifying minutes. I'd somehow gotten turned around completely and only found our site by following the scent of wood smoke. I rebuilt the fire immediately, making it even larger than before, and kept Diesel on a short leash for the rest of the night. Neither of us slept. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. I was packing up when I noticed the first really wrong thing. My water bottles, which I'd filled the previous evening, were empty. Not just low, completely dry. And my food supplies looked different. The beef jerky I'd packed looked gray and moldy, as if it had been sitting out for weeks instead of 2 days. I checked my phone for the time and date. The screen showed 3:47 a.m. October 15th, but that was impossible. I'd been watching the sunrise for the past hour, and yesterday had been October 14th. My phone had to be malfunctioning. Diesel was acting normal again, energetic and eager to explore. I decided to hike out immediately, cutting our trip short. Something was wrong with this place, and I didn't want to spend another night here. The hike back should have taken 3 hours. I'd timed it on the way in, marking waypoints on my GPS, but after 4 hours of walking, I hadn't reached a single familiar landmark. The trail I'd followed into the wilderness was gone, replaced by animal paths that seemed to lead in circles. My GPS showed my location as jumping around randomly, sometimes placing me miles from where I'd started, sometimes showing no signal at all. The compass app spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "We're lost," I told Diesel, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "But that's okay. We'll just head downhill until we find a stream, then follow it out." Except every direction seemed to be uphill. No matter which way I turned, the ground sloped away from me as if I was standing at the bottom of a vast bowl. It was impossible, but undeniable. By afternoon, I was exhausted and terrified. We'd been walking for 8 hours, and the forest looked exactly the same as when we'd started. Worse, the light was beginning to fade, though my watch only showed 2:30 p.m. I stopped to rest beside a fallen log and shared some of my remaining water with Diesel. He was panting heavily, his tongue lolling out. At least the jerky looked normal again. Maybe I'd just imagined its condition that morning. "We'll find our way out," I promised him, scratching behind his ears. "Tomorrow, we'll—" Diesel's ears perked up suddenly. He stared past me into the trees, and that familiar growl started in his throat. I turned to look but saw nothing except shadows and underbrush. "What now, boy?" The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse. Complete silence. Diesel's hackles rose and he backed against my legs, trembling. The forest around us had gone dead quiet again, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our position just outside my line of sight. They didn't sound quite right. Too heavy, with an odd dragging quality, as if something was being pulled along with each step. I grabbed Diesel's leash and stood slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The footsteps stopped immediately, but I could feel eyes watching us from the darkness between the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" No answer, just that oppressive silence and the weight of unseen attention. I started walking again, pulling Diesel along. He came reluctantly, constantly looking back over his shoulder. The footsteps resumed almost immediately, matching our pace but staying just out of sight. When we stopped, they stopped. When we hurried, they hurried. The sun was setting now. Actually setting, despite my watch reading only 3:15 p.m., the forest filled with long shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees that cast them. And still those footsteps followed us, getting closer. I broke into a run. Diesel kept pace easily, his fear apparently giving him energy. We crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs with those terrible footsteps always just behind us. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't dare slow down. We burst into a clearing and stopped short. It was our campsite. I recognized the fire ring and the flattened area where I'd pitched my tent. But that was impossible. I'd packed everything that morning and hiked for hours in the opposite direction. My tent was there, set up exactly as I'd left it the night before. The fire ring held cold ashes from our previous fire. My water bottles sat beside the pack, full again. "No," I whispered. "No, this isn't happening." Diesel whined and pressed against my legs. The footsteps had stopped at the edge of the clearing, but I could still feel that malevolent presence watching from the tree line. I had no choice but to make camp again. Night was falling fast. Too fast, and I couldn't navigate the forest in darkness. I rebuilt the fire with shaking hands, making it as large as possible. Diesel stayed close, occasionally letting out small whimpers of distress. As full darkness settled over the clearing, I heard a new sound. Singing. A low, melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was hauntingly beautiful, but wrong somehow, like a lullaby played backward. Diesel's behavior changed abruptly. His fear disappeared, replaced by that same vacant expression I'd seen the night before. He stood and walked toward the tree line, moving with mechanical precision. "Diesel, no!" I lunged for his leash, but he'd already slipped into the shadows. This time, I didn't follow. I sat by the fire, feeding it constantly and trying to ignore the singing that continued throughout the night. Sometimes I thought I heard Diesel's collar jingling in the distance, mixed with other sounds. Breaking branches, something large moving through the underbrush, and once, what might have been a human scream. When dawn finally came, Diesel returned. He emerged from the trees walking that same mechanical walk, his head held at that unnatural angle. But there was something else wrong now. His coat was matted with what looked like blood, though I couldn't see any wounds. And his eyes had changed. They were still amber, but the pupils were wrong. Too large, taking up almost the entire iris. And when he looked at me, there was no recognition there. No love, no loyalty, nothing I'd ever seen in those eyes before. "Diesel," I whispered. He sat down exactly 10 feet away, the same distance he'd maintained the first night, and stared at me. His tail didn't wag. He didn't pant or show any normal dog behavior. He just sat and watched with those horrible empty eyes. I tried calling his name, offering him water, even throwing a stick. Nothing. He remained perfectly still, like a statue of a dog rather than the living animal I'd known for 5 years. The wrongness of it made my skin crawl. This thing looked like Diesel, but it wasn't him. Something had taken my dog and sent back this hollow imitation. I packed my gear quickly, leaving out food and water in case the real Diesel was still out there somewhere. The thing that looked like my dog followed at exactly 10 feet, maintaining that precise distance no matter how I tried to approach it. The hike out was a nightmare of repetition. Every landmark I passed, I'd seen before. Every turn in the trail led to another turn I recognized. By midday, I was back at our campsite again, though I'd been walking away from it for hours. The not Diesel sat in the same spot and resumed its unblinking stare. "What do you want?" I screamed at the forest. "What did you do to my dog?" The singing started again, that same beautiful, wrong melody. This time, I thought I could make out words, though they were in no language I recognized. The not Diesel's head tilted slightly, as if it was listening. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that thing watching me. Twice I woke to find it had moved closer, not walking, just suddenly in a different position, like a video with missing frames. By the third time, it was close enough to touch. I grabbed my flashlight and a knife from my pack, backing away from the sleeping bag. The not Diesel's eyes reflected the light, but there was something behind them now. Something looking out through windows that used to belong to my loyal companion. "I know you're not him," I whispered. "Give him back." The thing that wore Diesel's shape tilted its head further, almost completely sideways. Then its mouth opened and my dog's familiar bark came out. But it was wrong. Too long, too loud, and underneath it was another sound. Something like laughter. I ran. This time, I didn't stop when I reached the campsite. I kept running, crashing through the forest in blind panic. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots caught my feet, but still I ran. Behind me, that horrible knot bark echoed through the trees, joined by the sound of something large pursuing me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing beside a stream I didn't recognize. The water was ice cold and tasted of minerals and decay. I drank anyway, too exhausted to care. When I looked up, the not Diesel was sitting on the opposite bank, still maintaining that 10-foot distance. Its head was completely upside down now, twisted in a way that would have broken a real dog's neck. And it was smiling. Or what passed for smiling when you turned a dog's mouth into something else entirely. "Please," I sobbed, "just give him back. I'll leave. I'll never come back here. Just give me my dog." The thing's smile widened, showing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. When it spoke, it used Diesel's voice but shaped it into words no dog could pronounce. "He's still here," it said, each word carefully enunciated. "Would you like to see him?" I should have said no, should have run again. But the hope that my real dog was still alive somewhere made me nod. The not Diesel's smile became impossibly wide. Its body began to change, stretching and distorting like clay being pulled apart. The familiar brown and black coat remained, but underneath it, something else was taking shape. Something with too many joints and limbs that bent in directions they shouldn't. As the transformation continued, I heard whimpering from inside the thing. Diesel's whimpering, muffled and distant but unmistakably his. He was in there, trapped inside this abomination. "Let him go," I screamed, lunging forward with my knife. The thing moved faster than thought, one elongated limb swatting me aside like an insect. I hit a tree hard enough to see stars, and when my vision cleared, it was standing over me. Still wearing pieces of Diesel's coat, but now I could see the reality underneath. Something ancient and hungry and utterly alien to everything I understood about the world. "He wanted to protect you," it said in a voice like breaking glass. "So we let him. He's our eyes now, our nose, our way of understanding your kind." I tried to crawl away, but it placed one impossible foot on my chest, pinning me to the ground. Up close, I could see that its eyes weren't eyes at all, but holes that went deeper than they should, filled with a darkness that seemed to move on its own. "We've been waiting so long for someone to find us," it continued. "The others were unsatisfying. But you brought us such a perfect gift. A creature that loves without condition, that would do anything to save you. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" The weight on my chest increased, making it hard to breathe. I could hear Diesel whimpering somewhere inside the thing, could almost see his familiar shape moving beneath its skin like a shadow. "What are you?" I gasped. "Hungry," it replied simply. "Always hungry. Your people used to know us, used to bring offerings to keep us satisfied. But they forgot, moved away, left us with only the deer and rabbits. Do you know how long it's been since we tasted something that could think? That could feel fear?" It leaned closer, and I could smell the sweet rot of its breath, could see my own reflection in those impossible not eyes. "But your dog, he's shown us something new. Loyalty, love, such interesting flavors. We think we'll keep him for a very long time." That's when I snapped. I'd lost everything else, my marriage, my home, my future. But I wouldn't lose Diesel. Not to this thing. I still had the knife. While it talked, while it gloated, I'd been working my free hand toward the blade. Now I drove it upward with everything I had, aiming for what might have been its throat. The scream it made was like nothing I'd ever heard. Part animal, part machinery, part something that had no name. It reared back, dark fluid spurting from the wound, and in that moment of distraction, I saw him. Diesel. The real Diesel, suspended somehow inside the creature's torso like an insect in amber. His eyes met mine, and I saw recognition there. Love. And something else. An understanding that we might both die here, but at least we'd be together. I stabbed again, and again, targeting the area where my dog was trapped. The thing thrashed and screamed, its form becoming more unstable with each wound. Pieces of it broke away, revealing glimpses of the forest beyond, as if it wasn't entirely solid. With a final, desperate thrust, I drove the blade deep into what might have been its heart. The creature froze, its impossible eyes going wide. Then it began to collapse, folding in on itself like a deflating balloon. Diesel fell out of the dissolving mass, unconscious but breathing. I gathered him in my arms, checking for injuries, crying with relief when I found none. He was wet with some kind of fluid that smelled like copper and ozone, but underneath that familiar scent of dog, my dog, was unchanged. The thing was still collapsing, its form becoming more translucent with each passing second. As it faded, I heard its voice one last time, weak but filled with malice. "This forest is ours," it whispered. "You can run, but we are old, and patient, and hungry. We will find you again." Then it was gone, leaving only a dark stain on the forest floor and the lingering smell of decay. Diesel stirred in my arms, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw me, his tail wagged weakly, and he licked my face with desperate affection. He was back. Really back. I didn't waste time trying to understand what had happened. I picked up my pack and carried Diesel away from that cursed place, hiking through the night by the light of my flashlight. This time, the paths led where they should. This time, my GPS worked. This time, when dawn came, I could see the ranger station in the distance. Ranger Mackenzie was waiting when I stumbled out of the forest, Diesel clutched in my arms. He took one look at us, bloodied, exhausted, traumatized, and nodded grimly. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "The thing in the deep woods." I nodded, too tired for words. "Most people don't come back," he continued. "Or if they do, they come back wrong, changed. But you..." He looked at Diesel, who was now standing on his own but staying close to my side. "You brought him back. That's never happened before." "What was it?" I asked. Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, studying the forest behind me. "My grandfather called it Wendigo," he said finally. "Something that was human once, maybe, before the hunger took it. Been in these woods longer than the trees," he said, feeding on whatever it could catch. He helped me to his truck, radioing for medical assistance. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest one last time. It looked normal in the morning light, peaceful, even beautiful. But I knew the truth now. Some places aren't meant for human eyes. Some hungers are older than civilization and just as patient. The doctors said I was dehydrated and suffering from exposure, but otherwise unharmed. They couldn't explain the strange wounds on my hands, the ones that looked like burns but didn't hurt. They couldn't explain why Diesel's collar was found 2 miles from where I said we'd been, or why it was covered in a substance that didn't appear in any database. They didn't believe my story, of course. The official report listed it as a case of exposure-induced hallucinations, but Ranger Mackenzie believed. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I get emails from him, updates on the forest, on the hikers who've gone missing near Hickory Ridge. The attacks have stopped since that night. Whatever I killed, it seems to have been the only one of its kind, at least in that part of the forest. But Mackenzie thinks there might be others, deeper in the wilderness, older and hungrier. I've moved twice since then, trying to put distance between myself and those memories. But the forest follows me in dreams, and sometimes I wake to find Diesel staring at the windows, growling at something only he can see. He's different now, still loyal, still loving, but there's a wariness in his eyes that wasn't there before. He knows what's out there in the dark places of the world, and sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I can smell that sweet rot on the air, and I know that somewhere, something ancient and patient is still waiting, still hungry. The scars on my hands have never healed properly. They throb when storms are coming, and they bleed without warning. The doctors say it's psychosomatic, but I know better. They're a reminder of what I did in those woods, of the choice I made to fight for what I loved instead of simply surviving. I've read everything I can find about Wendigo legends, about creatures that hunger for human flesh and souls. Most of the accounts are from further north, from the frozen wastes of Canada and Minnesota. But some are older, predating European settlement, speaking of things that walk the deep forests of what would become Indiana. The Native Americans who lived here first had words for such creatures, warnings passed down through generations. They knew to avoid certain places during certain times, to make offerings and speak the proper prayers. But that knowledge is mostly lost now, buried under centuries of civilization and rational thought. I've tried to forget, tried to move on with my life, but the dreams won't stop. In them, I'm back in that clearing, and the thing wearing Diesel's shape is still there, still watching. And sometimes, in the worst dreams, I realize that I never really rescued him at all. That what I carried out of the forest was just another imitation, more perfect than the first. I wake from those dreams checking his eyes, looking for signs of that vacant stare. So far, he's been himself, anxious and protective, but undeniably my dog. Still, I've started keeping a knife by my bed, just in case, because deep down I know the creature was right about one thing. The forest remembers me now, and whatever ancient hunger lurks in its depths, it's not finished with us yet. I just pray that when it comes, I'll be strong enough to fight again, for both our sakes. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Hoosier National Forest, deep in the hills of southern Indiana, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my girlfriend Sarah and our 2 friends from work, Kevin and Amanda. I should have listened to the locals in French Lick when they warned us about the old logging roads that wind through the most remote sections of the forest. Should have paid attention when the gas station attendant's face went pale at the mention of Pine Ridge Trail. Should have turned around when we found that rusted sign, half hidden by overgrown brush, that read, "Danger, unstable terrain," in faded red letters. But I didn't. None of us did. The trip had been Kevin's idea originally. He'd been going through a rough divorce and needed to get away from everything for a while. Amanda, always the caretaker of our little group, suggested we all go together for moral support. Sarah had been excited about the chance to use her new camping gear, and I just wanted to see her happy. She'd been working so many long hours at the law firm that we barely saw each other anymore. We left Indianapolis early on a Friday morning in October, the trees already starting to turn brilliant shades of orange and red. The drive down to southern Indiana was beautiful, winding through small towns and rolling hills dotted with farmhouses and old barns. Everything felt normal then. Everything felt safe. The Hoosier National Forest stretched out before us like a green carpet when we finally reached the trailhead parking area. There were maybe 3 other cars there, which Kevin said was perfect. He wanted isolation, and it looked like we'd found it. The Pine Ridge Trail was marked as a moderate difficulty hike, with several designated camping spots scattered throughout the 18-mile loop. "Look at this place," Sarah said, shouldering her pack and breathing in the crisp autumn air. "It's like something out of a fairy tale." She wasn't wrong. The forest was stunning, with towering oak and maple trees creating a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight made it to the forest floor. The trail was well maintained for the first few miles, clearly marked with blue blazes painted on tree trunks every 50 yards or so. Kevin seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in months as we hiked deeper into the woods. Amanda was her usual chatty self, pointing out different types of wildflowers and making jokes that had us all laughing. The 4 of us had been friends since college, and despite the stress of adult life and Kevin's recent troubles, It felt good to be together again. We made good time for the first few hours, stopping occasionally to take pictures or share trail mix. The plan was to hike about 6 miles in and set up camp at a spot called Whispering Pines Clearing, then explore some of the smaller side trails over the next 2 days before hiking back out on Sunday. It was around 3 in the afternoon when we first noticed something was off. "Did anyone else see that?" Sarah asked, stopping suddenly on the trail. We all turned to look where she was pointing, but there was nothing there except trees and shadows. "See what?" Amanda asked. "I thought I saw someone watching us from behind that big oak tree over there." Sarah squinted into the forest. "Probably just my imagination." Kevin laughed. "You're being paranoid. We're in the middle of nowhere." But I had seen it too. Just a flash of movement like someone ducking behind a tree. I didn't say anything, though. Didn't want to worry Sarah more than she already was. We kept hiking, but the mood had shifted slightly. We were all a little more aware of our surroundings, a little more alert to every sound. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful and welcoming earlier, now felt like it was watching us. About an hour later, we reached what should have been the Whispering Pines clearing according to our map. But the spot we found didn't match the description in our trail guide at all. Instead of a large open meadow with a designated fire ring and picnic table, we found ourselves in a small clearing that was barely big enough for our 2 tents. There was no fire ring, no picnic table, and no trail marker indicating this was an official campsite. "This can't be right," Amanda said, checking her GPS device. "According to this, we should still be another half-mile from the clearing." I pulled out our paper map and compass, trying to make sense of our location. The trail we'd been following seemed to have veered off course somewhere, though I couldn't figure out exactly where. The blue blazes were still visible on the trees around us, so we had to be on the right trail. "Maybe the GPS is glitchy out here," Kevin suggested. "You know how technology gets in remote areas." Sarah was walking around the perimeter of the small clearing, frowning. "This doesn't feel right," she said. "Something about this place is off." I knew what she meant. There was an oppressive quality to the air here, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The trees surrounding the clearing seemed to lean inward, creating shadows that were deeper and darker than they should have been for mid-afternoon. And there was a smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like wet earth and something else I couldn't identify. "We should keep going," Sarah said. "Find the real campsite." But Kevin was already unloading his pack. "Come on, guys. This spot is fine. We're all tired, and it's going to be dark in a few hours. Let's just set up camp here and figure out where we are in the morning." Amanda agreed with Kevin, and eventually Sarah and I were outvoted. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the small clearing, Kevin and Amanda sharing one tent, Sarah and I in the other. As we worked, I noticed more things that bothered me. There were no animal sounds in this part of the forest. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. Just an unnatural silence that seemed to press down on us like a heavy blanket. The trees themselves looked wrong too, now that I was paying attention. Their bark was darker than it should have been, almost black in places, with strange markings that looked almost like symbols carved into the wood. When I mentioned this to Kevin, he just shrugged. "Probably just natural weathering," he said. "Or maybe disease. Trees get all kinds of fungal infections." But they didn't look like fungal infections. They looked deliberate. As evening approached, we gathered wood for a fire, and Kevin tried to get it started using his supposedly foolproof fire-starting kit. The wood was dry. We'd made sure of that. But the fire kept going out. Every time Kevin got a small flame going, it would flicker and die as if someone was blowing on it. After the 5th attempt, Amanda took over, and she had the same problem. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, striking another match. "This should be working." When the fire finally did catch, it burned with an odd blue-green tint that none of us could explain. The flames danced and flickered in patterns that didn't match the gentle evening breeze, sometimes seeming to reach toward us with finger-like tendrils. "Must be some kind of mineral in the wood," I said, though I'd never seen anything like it before. We cooked dinner over the strange fire, just instant noodles and canned soup, nothing fancy. But even the simple food tasted off, bitter and metallic, like the flavor of fear. We ate mostly in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As full darkness fell, the forest around us came alive with sounds. Not the normal sounds of nocturnal animals, but something else entirely. Whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Footsteps that circled our campsite just beyond the reach of our firelight. The occasional crack of a branch as if something large was moving through the underbrush. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, moving closer to me. We all heard it. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been chanting or singing, but was too distant and distorted to make out any words. It seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding us. "Probably just other campers," Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. We decided to turn in early, partly because we were tired, but mostly because none of us wanted to admit how scared we were becoming. Sarah and I zipped ourselves into our tent and lay in our sleeping bags, listening to the sounds of the forest around us. "Michael," Sarah whispered in the darkness, "I want to leave tomorrow, first thing in the morning." "Okay," I whispered back. "We'll talk to Kevin and Amanda about cutting the trip short." But sleep was a long time coming. Every few minutes one of us would hear something. Footsteps circling the tent, the sound of the tent fabric being brushed against from the outside, what sounded like someone calling our names from deep in the forest. We lay there, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imagination or the natural sounds of the wilderness. But deep down, we both knew something was very wrong. I must have finally dozed off sometime after midnight because I was awakened by the sound of our tent zipper being opened. I sat up quickly, expecting to see Sarah getting up to use the bathroom, but she was still lying beside me, fast asleep. The tent flap was hanging open, moving slightly in the breeze. Cool air was flowing in, along with that strange earthy smell I'd noticed earlier, now much stronger. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her gently. "Sarah, wake up." She stirred and opened her eyes. "What's wrong?" "The tent is open. Did you unzip it?" She sat up, immediately alert. "No, I've been asleep." She looked at the open flap, then at me. "You didn't open it?" I shook my head. We both stared at the opening for a long moment, neither of us wanting to get up and close it. Finally, I forced myself to move. I crawled over to the tent entrance and stuck my head out to look around the campsite. The fire had burned down to just glowing embers, casting barely enough light to see by. Kevin and Amanda's tent was still zipped shut, and I could hear Kevin's familiar snoring coming from inside. Everything looked normal, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I quickly zipped the tent closed and checked to make sure the zipper was pulled all the way down. Then I lay back down next to Sarah, both of us wide awake now. "How did it get open?" she whispered. "I don't know. Maybe the zipper came undone on its own." But we both knew that wasn't possible. The zipper had been pulled completely closed when we went to sleep, and tent zippers didn't just open themselves. We didn't sleep much after that. Every few minutes, one of us would hear something that made us both freeze and listen intently. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of something large moving through the trees around our campsite. At one point, we both clearly heard what sounded like a child crying somewhere in the distance, but when I suggested we should investigate, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "Don't go out there." Something in her voice, a primal fear that went beyond rational thought, made me stay put. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first gray light began filtering through the trees, I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Everything appeared normal in the pale morning light. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only a circle of cold ashes. Kevin and Amanda's tent was still closed. I got dressed and crawled out of the tent, stretching muscles that were stiff from a night of tension. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more like the beautiful wilderness we'd hiked into the day before. But the feeling of wrongness was still there, just beneath the surface. Sarah emerged from the tent a few minutes later, looking as tired as I felt. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Not much. You?" She shook her head. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, or feel like something was watching me. We started to get breakfast ready, hoping the familiar routine would help us feel more normal. I was digging in my pack for the camp stove when I realized something was wrong. "Sarah," I said slowly, "where's our food?" She looked up from where she was rolling up her sleeping bag. "What do you mean?" "The food. All of our food. It's gone." I dumped the entire contents of my pack onto the ground. Everything else was there. My clothes, toiletries, first aid kit, everything except the food we'd packed for the weekend. Not just my food, but all of it. The trail mix, energy bars, instant oatmeal, even the coffee, all gone. Sarah checked her pack with the same result. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "How could it all just disappear?" Maybe an animal got into our packs during the night, but there were no signs of animal intrusion. No torn fabric, no scattered packaging, no tracks around our campsite. The food had simply vanished as if it had never been there at all. "We need to wake up Kevin and Amanda," I said. "Check their food supplies." But when I went to their tent and called Kevin's name, there was no response. No snoring, no movement, nothing. "Kevin," I called louder. "Amanda?" Silence. Sarah came over to stand beside me. Maybe they're just sleeping really deeply. I reached out and shook the tent gently. "Kevin, Amanda, wake up." Still nothing. The tent wasn't moving at all, as if there was no one inside. "This is ridiculous," I muttered and started to unzip their tent flap. "Michael, wait," Sarah said, grabbing my arm. "What if—" But I was already pulling the zipper down. The tent flap fell open, revealing the interior. The tent was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No sleeping bags, no backpacks, no personal belongings. Nothing to indicate that Kevin and Amanda had ever been there at all. Sarah and I stared into the empty tent for a long moment, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. "They must have gotten up early," Sarah said finally. "Gone for a hike or something? With all their gear? Maybe they moved to a different campsite." But we both knew that didn't make sense. Why would they pack up all their belongings and leave without saying anything? And why was their tent still here if they'd moved? I walked around the campsite looking for any sign of where they might have gone. There were no footprints leading away from the clearing, no disturbed vegetation, no indication that anyone had left the area during the night. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "Right now?" I couldn't agree more. We quickly packed up our remaining belongings, which took almost no time since most of our food had mysteriously disappeared, and struck our tent. Within 20 minutes, we were ready to leave. The only problem was we couldn't find the trail. The day before, we'd hiked into the clearing from the south, following the blue blazes marked on the trees. But now, in the morning light, there were no blue blazes visible anywhere around the perimeter of the clearing. The trees that I was certain had been marked the day before now showed only natural bark patterns. "This is impossible," I said, checking my compass. "The trail has to be here somewhere." We spent an hour walking around the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of the trail we'd followed in. Sarah tried her GPS device, but it showed our location as a blank area with no trails or landmarks marked. My paper map might as well have been useless. None of the topographical features around us matched what was printed on it. "It's like the trail just disappeared," Sarah said. We finally picked a direction that seemed to lead downhill, figuring that following the slope would eventually lead us to a road or stream, and started hiking. But after an hour of walking through increasingly dense forest, we realized we were going in circles. The same fallen log, the same oddly shaped boulder, the same cluster of white birch trees kept appearing in our path. "This isn't possible," I said, stopping beside the fallen log for the third time. "We're not going in circles. I've been checking my compass constantly. But there was no denying it. Somehow, we kept ending up in the same spots, no matter which direction we tried to go. By noon, we were both exhausted and starting to panic. We'd been hiking for hours, but seemed to be covering the same ground over and over again. Worse, the forest around us was changing. The trees looked different, darker, more twisted. The shadows were deeper and seemed to move independently of the branches that cast them. "We need to rest," Sarah said, sitting down on a mossy rock. "Figure out what's happening here." I sat down beside her, trying to make sense of our situation. Maybe we're just disoriented, lost. It happens to hikers all the time. "Michael." Sarah's voice was very quiet. "Look around. Really look." I did, and immediately saw what she meant. The trees surrounding us weren't just different from the ones we'd seen earlier, they were impossible. Oaks with maple leaves, pine trees with bark that looked like birch, branches that grew in spirals, defying everything I knew about how trees developed, and carved into many of the trunks were symbols that definitely weren't natural. They looked old, worn by weather and time, but clearly deliberate. Circles intersected by lines, triangular shapes with dots in the center, what looked like crude representations of human figures. "We're not lost," Sarah said. "Something brought us here. Something is keeping us here." As if in response to her words, we heard the sound of footsteps approaching through the forest. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched through the fallen leaves. Sarah and I both stood up, looking around for whoever was coming. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. We waited, listening, but heard nothing else. Then, from a completely different direction, the footsteps resumed. This time, they sounded like they were circling us, staying just far enough away that we couldn't see who was making them. "We should go," Sarah whispered. We started walking again, choosing our direction at random since it didn't seem to matter which way we went. The footsteps followed us, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. Occasionally we would catch glimpses of movement between the trees, a flash of clothing, a pale face that disappeared the moment we turned to look at it. "Who's there?" I shouted at one point, fed up with the game of cat and mouse. "What do you want?" The only response was a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound like wind through dead leaves. As afternoon wore on, the forest grew darker despite the fact that the sun should still have been high in the sky. The canopy above us seemed to be thickening, blocking out more and more light with each passing hour. The temperature was dropping too, and our breath began to mist in the increasingly cold air. "This isn't natural," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's October in Indiana. It shouldn't be this cold." She was right. When we'd started our hike the day before, the temperature had been in the comfortable 70s. Now it felt like it was barely above freezing. That's when we saw the cabin. It appeared suddenly in a small clearing ahead of us, as if it had materialized out of thin air. A small, wooden structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof was partially collapsed, and vines had grown over most of the walls, but the basic structure was still intact. "Thank God," Sarah said. "Maybe there's someone inside who can help us." But as we got closer, I could see that the cabin was definitely abandoned. The windows were broken, and the door hung open on rusted hinges. Still, it would provide shelter, and maybe there would be some indication of where we were. Inside, the cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace along one wall and what had once been a wooden table and chairs in the center. Everything was covered with dust and cobwebs, and the floorboards creaked ominously under our feet. But it was what was on the walls that made us both stop dead in our tracks. Photographs. Dozens and dozens of photographs pinned to the wooden walls with rusty nails, and every single one showed people in the forest. People camping, hiking, taking pictures of each other beside trees and streams. People who looked happy and carefree, just like we had looked the day before. "My God," Sarah whispered, moving closer to examine the photos. These must go back decades. The photographs showed a progression through time. black and white images that looked like they were from the 1940s or 50s, color photos from later decades, and more recent digital prints. But they all had one thing in common. They showed people in what looked like the same forest we were in now, and at the bottom of each photo, written in the same handwriting, were names and dates. Robert and Helen Morrison, 1953. The Jenkins family, 1967. Dave Miller and Tom Richardson, 1984. I was studying the photos when Sarah made a sound of pure terror behind me. I turned to see her staring at one particular photograph, her face white as paper. It was a recent digital print showing 4 people standing beside a familiar-looking fallen log. 4 people who looked happy and excited to be starting their camping adventure. 4 people who looked exactly like Kevin, Lee, Amanda, Sarah, and me. The handwriting at the bottom read, Kevin King, Amanda Wright, Sarah Rodriguez, and Michael Williams, October 2025. That's impossible, I said, even as I was looking at the undeniable evidence. That picture was taken yesterday. We were right there when... But who took it? We didn't have anyone take our picture. Sarah was backing toward the door. We need to leave, now. But before we could move, we heard the sound of the cabin door closing behind us. I spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway. A woman, or what had once been a woman. She was tall and gaunt, with long gray hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. Her clothes looked like they'd been scavenged from different time periods. A Victorian-era dress beneath a World War II-era coat, modern hiking boots on her feet. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were completely black, with no whites visible at all, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Welcome," she said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, though she was standing right in front of us. "I've been waiting for you." "Who are you?" I managed to ask. She smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "I have many names. The locals used to call me the Pine Ridge Witch, before they learned to stay away from my forest. You can call me Vera." "We don't want any trouble," Sarah said. "We're just lost. We're trying to find our way back to the parking area." Vera laughed, and the sound made the cabin walls vibrate. "Oh, my dear, no one finds their way back from my forest. Haven't you seen the photographs? I've been collecting visitors for such a long time." "What happened to them?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "They're still here," Vera said. "All of them. They've become part of the forest. Part of my collection. Just like your friends Kevin and Amanda became part of it last night." My heart lurched. "What did you do to them?" "Nothing they didn't agree to eventually. They fought at first, of course. They always do. But the forest has ways of convincing people to stay." Kevin lasted until almost dawn before he stopped struggling. Amanda was more stubborn, but even she gave in eventually. Sarah grabbed my hand, squeezing so tight it hurt. "You're lying." "Am I?" Vera gestured toward the photographs on the wall. "Look more closely at the pictures, dear. Look at their eyes." I didn't want to look, but I found myself turning toward the wall of photographs anyway. And now that I was looking for it, I could see what she meant. In photo after photo, the people's eyes were wrong. Some showed only whites, rolled back in their heads. Others were completely black, like Vera's. And in the most recent photos, I could see something moving beneath the surface of their eyes, like worms crawling under their skin. "The forest changes them," Vera explained conversationally. "Slowly, over time. It takes their memories first, then their personalities, then their humanity. In the end, they become extensions of the forest itself. Guardians, protectors. They help me recruit new visitors." "That's what was following us," Sarah said. "In the woods. That was them." "Very good," Vera said approvingly. "Some of them, yes. Your friends Kevin and Amanda should be fully integrated within a few more hours. Then they'll be able to help me with you two." I was backing toward the far wall of the cabin, pulling Sarah with me, trying to think of a way out. But Vera seemed to anticipate my thoughts. "There's nowhere to run," she said. "The forest extends for miles in every direction now. Miles and miles of trees that will lead you in circles until you're too tired to fight anymore. Until you're ready to accept what you've become." "What do you want from us?" I asked. "The same thing I want from everyone who comes to my forest. I want you to stay. I want you to become part of something larger than yourselves. The forest is alive, you see. It feeds on human consciousness, human memories, human emotions. And I am its shepherd." "You're insane," Sarah said. Vera's smile widened. "Am I? Or am I simply offering you immortality? Everyone in those photographs is still alive, in a sense. They've become part of something eternal, something that will last long after the cities crumble and the roads are overgrown with weeds." She took a step toward us, and I saw that her movements weren't quite human. She seemed to glide rather than walk, and her feet didn't make any sound on the wooden floor. "The process doesn't have to be painful," she continued. "If you don't fight it, it can even be pleasant. You'll feel yourself becoming one with the forest, one with all the others who have joined us over the years. You'll never be alone again. Never be afraid again." "Never," Sarah said firmly. Vera sighed. "They all say that at first, but you'll change your mind. They always do." That's when I noticed the windows. They'd been broken when we entered the cabin, but now they were intact. Not just intact, they were barred with thick iron grating that definitely hadn't been there before. Vera saw me looking. "The cabin changes to meet our needs," she explained. "Right now, it needs to keep you safe while you adjust to your new situation." I was still searching for a way out when I remembered something. The strange symbols carved into the trees outside. They'd looked old, worn by weather and time. But what if they weren't just decorative? What if they served a purpose? "Sarah," I whispered, "do you still have that lighter in your pocket?" She nodded slightly, not taking her eyes off Vera. "The photographs," I said quietly. "When I give you the signal, light them on fire." Vera heard me, of course. "That won't help you," she said. "The photographs are just documentation. Destroying them won't free anyone." But I had a feeling she was wrong. The photographs felt important, central to whatever power she held over the people who came into her forest. And fire was one of the oldest forms of purification known to humanity. "Now," I said. Sarah pulled out her lighter and flicked it to life. Vera screamed and lunged toward us, but I threw myself between them, giving Sarah the time she needed to touch the flame to the nearest photograph. The old paper caught fire immediately, and the flames spread quickly to the other photographs. Within seconds, half the wall was ablaze, and as the photographs burned, Vera's screams grew louder and more desperate. "You don't understand," she shrieked. "Without the forest, they'll die. They'll really die." But I was already kicking at the cabin door, which had somehow become unlocked when the fire started. It burst open, and Sarah and I ran outside into the rapidly fading daylight. Behind us, the cabin was fully engulfed in flames now, and we could hear Vera's voice calling after us. But her voice was changing, becoming less human and more like the sound of wind through dead leaves. We ran through the forest, not caring which direction we were going, just trying to get as far away from the burning cabin as possible. The trees around us were changing again, becoming more normal-looking with each step we took. The impossible oak-maple hybrids were replaced by ordinary trees, and the strange symbols carved into the bark were fading before our eyes. After what felt like hours of running, we finally saw lights ahead of us. Real lights, the parking area where we'd left our car 2 days ago. We stumbled out of the tree line, gasping and exhausted, but alive. Our car was still there, covered with fallen leaves as if it had been sitting there for weeks instead of 2 days. But it started immediately when I turned the key, and we drove away from the Hoosier National Forest as fast as the winding roads would allow. We stopped at the first motel we found and called the police to report Kevin and Amanda missing. The officers who took our statement were polite but skeptical. When they investigated the Pine Ridge Trail the next day, they found no trace of our friends, no burned cabin, and no clearing where we'd camped. According to the rangers, the Pine Ridge Trail had been closed for years due to unstable terrain and had never had any designated camping areas. But I know what we experienced was real. The photographs we found in that cabin were real. Vera was real. And somewhere in those woods, if you know where to look, you can still find the symbols carved into the trees. The local newspaper archives, when we checked them later, contained dozens of reports over the years of hikers who had gone missing in the remote sections of the Hoosier National Forest. People who had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind cars in parking areas and families who never stopped looking for them. Sarah and I don't go camping anymore. We don't even like to drive through heavily forested areas. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound in my dreams. The sound of wind through dead leaves that might have been laughter. And sometimes, when I'm walking through the city and pass by a park or even just a tree-lined street, I catch a glimpse of something moving between the branches. Something that might be watching. Something that might be waiting. Because I don't think we really escaped that forest at all. I think part of it came with us. Part of it is still here, still growing, still looking for new visitors to add to its collection. The forest is patient. It can wait. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote backwoods of Hoosier National Forest, Indiana, near the abandoned logging roads that wind through the densest part of the wilderness, where cell towers can't reach and the canopy blocks out most of the sky. The divorce papers had been finalized for exactly 3 weeks when Brian Wright suggested the camping trip. "You need to get out of that apartment, Ken," he'd said over beers at O'Malley's, his weathered face creased with concern. "All you've been doing is staring at those 4 walls and drinking yourself stupid." Brian was right, of course. He usually was. We'd been friends since high school, and he knew me better than anyone, sometimes better than I knew myself. The split with Sarah had gutted me worse than I'd expected. After 12 years of marriage, I'd thought we were solid. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. "Where were you thinking?" I'd asked, already knowing I'd agree to whatever he suggested. Brian had this way of making decisions that made everything seem simpler. Hoosier National Forest. There's this spot I found last summer, way off the beaten path. No cell service, no people, just trees and quiet. Perfect for clearing your head. So here we were, 3 days into October, our backpacks loaded with enough supplies for a week in the wilderness. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the forest in brilliant reds and golds that should have been beautiful, should have been peaceful. Instead, something felt wrong from the moment we left the main trail. It started with small things. My phone had shown 2 bars at the trailhead, but by the time we'd hiked 3 miles in, it was completely dead. Not low battery. Dead. The screen wouldn't even light up when I pressed the power button. "Mine too," Brian said when I mentioned it, pulling his phone from his pocket. The screen was black, and when he tried to turn it on, nothing happened. Must be some kind of electromagnetic interference. These old-growth forests can be weird like that. I accepted his explanation because I wanted to, because the alternative, that something was actively isolating us, was too unsettling to consider. The GPS unit Brian carried was equally useless. The screen flickered between static and error messages, never managing to lock onto our position. We had to rely on his paper map and compass, old-school navigation that felt increasingly primitive as the afternoon wore on. "The campsite should be just over this ridge," Brian said around 4 o'clock, checking his compass against the topographical map. We'd been hiking for 6 hours, and my legs ached in that deep, bone-tired way that comes from carrying a 40-pound pack over rough terrain. But when we crested the ridge, there was nothing. Just more forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. The trees seemed to press closer here, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight made it to the forest floor. Brian frowned at his map, turning it this way and that. "This doesn't make sense. According to this, we should be looking at a clearing with a small stream running through it." I looked around at the dense woodland, feeling the first prickle of unease. Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere? No, I've been checking the compass every half-mile. We're on the right bearing. He folded the map and stuffed it back into his pack. Let's keep going. Maybe the clearing is just further than I remembered. We hiked for another hour before Brian finally admitted we were lost. The forest had grown darker around us, not just from the approaching evening, but from something else. A quality of shadow that seemed to absorb light rather than simply blocking it. "We need to make camp," I said, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "It'll be dark soon, and we don't want to be stumbling around out here in the dark." Brian nodded, but I could see the frustration in his face. He prided himself on his outdoor skills, and getting lost on what should have been a simple hike to a familiar campsite was eating at him. We found a relatively flat spot between two massive oak trees and set up our tents as the last light faded from the sky. The forest around us was eerily quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, not even the buzz of insects. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched as we gathered deadwood for a fire. The sensation crept up my spine like cold fingers, making me glance over my shoulder every few seconds. But there was nothing there. Just the dark spaces between the trees where the firelight couldn't reach. The fire itself was problematic. The wood was dry enough and we had plenty of tinder, but the flames kept guttering out for no apparent reason. Every time we got a decent blaze going, it would suddenly die down to barely glowing embers, as if something was sucking the oxygen right out of it. "Must be the wind," Brian muttered after the fourth time we had to rebuild the fire, though there wasn't even the slightest breeze that I could feel. When we finally got a stable fire going, it burned with an odd blue tinge around the edges that neither of us commented on. Some things are better left unspoken, even when they're staring you right in the face. We ate our dinner of canned chili and crackers in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The quiet was getting to me more than I wanted to admit. After living in the city for 15 years, I'd forgotten how absolute the silence could be in deep wilderness. But this felt different. Not peaceful, but expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. "Ken," Brian said suddenly, making me jump, "do you ever feel like you're being punished for something?" The question caught me off guard. Brian wasn't usually one for philosophical discussions, especially not the moody kind that I'd been subjecting him to for the past month. "What do you mean?" He stared into the fire, his face serious in the flickering light. "Like maybe the universe is paying you back for something you did wrong, something you can't even remember doing." I thought about Sarah, about the way she'd looked at me the day she moved out. Not angry, but disappointed, like I'd failed some test I didn't even know I was taking. "Yeah," I said. "I know exactly what you mean." We sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the strange blue flames dance in the darkness. The fire seemed to be the only thing keeping the forest at bay, creating a small circle of warmth and light in an ocean of black. I must have dozed off in my camp chair, because the next thing I knew, Brian was shaking my shoulder. "Ken, wake up, the fire's out." I opened my eyes to complete darkness. Not just the darkness of a moonless night, but something deeper. A blackness so absolute it seemed to have weight and substance. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. "How long was I asleep?" I asked, fumbling for my flashlight. "Maybe an hour. I dozed off too. When I woke up, the fire was stone cold, like it had been out for hours." My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing our campsite exactly as we'd left it. But something was wrong. The fire pit, which should have been full of glowing coals and warm ash, was completely cold. When I touched the stones around the fire ring, they were as cold as if they'd never been heated at all. "That's impossible," I said. "A fire that size should stay warm for hours." Brian was checking his own flashlight, the beam wavering as his hands shook slightly. "Ken, look at this." He was pointing his light at his watch. The digital display showed 11:47 p.m., but that couldn't be right. We'd started the fire around 7, and I'd only been asleep for what felt like an hour at most. I checked my own watch, an old analog piece that had belonged to my father. The hands pointed to 11:47 as well, but they weren't moving. Even as I watched, the second hand remained frozen in place. "We need to get some sleep," Brian said, but his voice was tight with stress. "We'll figure this out in the morning." I wanted to argue, to insist that we pack up and hike out immediately, but where would we go? We were lost in the middle of nowhere, and stumbling around in the dark would only make things worse. We rebuilt the fire, and this time it caught normally, burning with regular orange flames. I crawled into my tent, but sleep was impossible. Every sound, every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the darkness beyond my thin nylon walls. Sometime during the night, I heard Brian's tent zipper open. "Nature call," he whispered when I poked my head out to check on him. "Be right back." I watched his flashlight beam disappear into the trees and waited for him to return, and waited, and waited. After what felt like an hour, I called out to him, "Brian, you okay out there?" No response. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of my tent. The fire had died down to embers again, casting barely enough light to see the edge of our campsite. "Brian," I called louder, my voice echoing strangely in the dense forest. "Where are you?" Still nothing. I followed the direction he'd taken, my flashlight beam dancing across tree trunks and undergrowth. About 50 yards from camp, I found something that made my blood run cold. Brian's flashlight, lying on the ground, still turned on. The lens was cracked and there was something dark smeared across the plastic, something that looked suspiciously like blood. "Brian!" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. "Brian, where are you?" My voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. I spent the next hour searching in ever-widening circles, calling his name until my throat was raw, but there was no sign of him anywhere. When I finally made it back to camp, exhausted and terrified, I found Brian sitting by the fire. "Hey, Ken," he said without looking up. "Where'd you go?" I stared at him, my heart pounding. He was exactly where I'd left him, sitting in his camp chair, staring into the flames. But something was wrong. Something in his posture, in the way he held his head. "Brian, I've been looking for you for over an hour. I found your flashlight in the woods." He turned to look at me then, and I saw his face in the firelight. It was Brian. Definitely Brian, but his expression was off. His smile was too wide, stretching further across his face than it should have. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "I've been here the whole time," he said, and his voice sounded wrong too. Flatter, emotionless. "You must have been dreaming." I looked down at my hands and realized I was still holding his broken flashlight, the bloody lens catching the firelight. "Then what's this?" I held up the light. Brian's too wide smile never wavered. "That's not mine. Mine's right here." He held up an identical flashlight, unbroken and clean. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. "Brian, what happened to you out there?" "Nothing happened. I told you, I've been here the whole time." He turned back to stare at the fire, that disturbing smile still fixed on his face. "You should get some sleep, Ken. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but something in his tone warned me not to push. Instead, I retreated to my tent, zipping the door closed and lying awake in the darkness, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Brian moving around outside. Not the normal sounds of someone tending the fire or going to relieve himself, but deliberate, careful movements as if he was trying not to wake me. I peered through a gap in my tent zipper and saw him crouched by the fire, but he wasn't adding wood or stoking the flames. He was just sitting there, motionless, staring into the forest with that same fixed smile. And he was whispering something. Too low for me to make out the words, but the rhythm of it made my skin crawl. It sounded almost like a prayer, but not to any god I'd want to meet. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through my tent walls. I could hear Brian moving around outside, the normal sounds of someone breaking camp. "Morning, sunshine," he called when I emerged from my tent. "Ready to head home?" He looked completely normal in the daylight. Same weathered face, same easy grin, same clothes he'd been wearing yesterday. If not for the broken flashlight still lying by my sleeping bag, I might have convinced myself that the previous night had been a stress-induced nightmare. "How do you want to do this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "We're still lost, and our compass is acting up." "No problem," Brian said, shouldering his pack. "I know exactly where we are. Just follow me." He set off through the trees with confident strides, not bothering to check his compass or consult the map. I hurried to catch up, my pack bouncing awkwardly on my shoulders. "How do you know which way to go?" I asked. "I can feel it," he said without turning around. "The way out. Can't you feel it pulling at you?" I couldn't feel anything except increasing dread, but I followed him anyway. What choice did I have? We hiked for hours through terrain that grew increasingly strange. The trees were wrong somehow. Too tall, too straight, with bark that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The forest floor was covered with a thick layer of leaves that never crunched under our feet, muffling our footsteps until it felt like we were walking through a dream. And Brian wasn't sweating. Despite the weight of his pack and the punishing pace he was setting, there wasn't a drop of perspiration on his face or neck. When I commented on it, he just smiled that too wide smile. "I feel great," he said. "Better than I have in years. All that stuff I was worried about before, work, money, relationships, none of it matters out here. Out here, everything is simple." The way he said it made my stomach clench. There was something hungry in his voice, something that hadn't been there before. "What do you mean, simple?" I asked. "Predator and prey," he said, still walking. "Hunt or be hunted. Eat or be eaten. The way things were meant to be." I stopped walking. "Brian, what the hell are you talking about?" He turned around then, and I saw that his eyes had changed color. They'd been brown yesterday, the same warm brown they'd been for the 20 years I'd known him. Now they were pale yellow, with pupils that contracted to vertical slits in the sunlight. "Don't you feel it, Ken?" he asked, taking a step toward me. "The hunger? The need? It's been growing in me all morning, and it's so much stronger than anything I've ever felt." I backed away, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife on my belt. "Stay away from me." Brian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You can't run from me, Ken. We're in my territory now, and I know every tree, every rock, every hiding place. But don't worry, I'll make it quick, I promise." His face was changing as he spoke, the bones shifting and elongating, the skin stretching tight over new contours. His teeth were growing longer and sharper, and his fingernails had become claws. I turned and ran. The forest exploded into motion around me as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear Brian, or the thing that had been Brian, giving chase, moving through the trees with inhuman speed and grace. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever my best friend had become. The pack on my shoulders threw off my balance, making me stumble and nearly fall with every few steps, but I didn't dare stop to shed it. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, and I could hear Brian calling my name in a voice that was barely human anymore. "Ken! Don't run from me, Ken! I just want to taste you." I crashed through a stand of young pine trees and found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. The drop was at least 30 feet to a rocky stream bed below. Not necessarily fatal, but definitely not something I wanted to attempt with a 40-pound pack on my back. The sound of breaking branches behind me was getting closer. I had maybe 30 seconds before Brian caught up to me, and I could either jump or turn and fight. I chose to fight. I spun around just as Brian burst through the trees, and what I saw made my sanity stretch to the breaking point. He was still recognizably Brian, but stretched and distorted like a funhouse mirror reflection. His limbs were too long, his torso too thin, and his face had elongated into something that was almost wolf-like, but not quite. His yellow eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "There you are," he said in a voice like wind through dead leaves. I was starting to think you didn't want to play." I pulled my hunting knife from its sheath, the 6-inch blade looking pathetically inadequate against the creature that had been my friend. "What did you do with Brian?" I demanded, trying to keep the terror out of my voice. "I am Brian," it said, tilting its head at an impossible angle. "I'm just more now. Better." The hunger showed me what I was meant to be. It lunged at me with speed that shouldn't have been possible, claws extended and mouth open wide. I threw myself to the side, slashing with the knife as I moved. The blade caught it across the ribs, opening a gash that should have been deep enough to cause serious injury. Instead, the wound sealed itself almost immediately, the torn flesh knitting back together as I watched. "You can't hurt me. Hurt can," it said, circling me now like a predator toying with its prey. "Not really, but I can hurt you. I can hurt you in ways you can't even imagine." I feinted left and then dove right, trying to get past it and back into the trees, but it was faster than me. Much faster. It caught me around the waist and lifted me off the ground, its claws digging into my sides hard enough to draw blood. "I'm going to eat you slowly," it whispered in my ear, its breath hot and fetid. "Starting with your fingers and toes, working my way up. I want you to watch. I want you to understand what you're becoming." Something snapped inside my head. Not sanity breaking, but clarity arriving like a lightning bolt. This thing wasn't Brian. It might wear his face and speak with his voice, but Brian Wright had died in the forest last night. This was something else, something that fed on human flesh and enjoyed the terror of its victims. And I wasn't going to die feeding its sadistic appetite. I drove my knee up as hard as I could, catching it in what would have been the solar plexus on a human. It grunted and loosened its grip just enough for me to break free. Before it could recover, I spun around and drove my knife straight into its left eye. The creature screamed, a sound like a wildcat being tortured, and staggered backward, black blood streaming down its face. For the first time since the attack began, it looked genuinely hurt. "That," it snarled, pulling the knife from its eye socket, "was a mistake." But I was already moving, not toward the trees, but toward the edge of the ravine. If I couldn't outfight this thing, and I couldn't outrun it, then I had one option left. I jumped. The fall felt like it lasted forever, long enough for me to see the creature. The Wendigo, I realized, remembering old stories Brian had told me around campfires, reached the edge of the ravine and looked down at me with its one remaining eye. I hit the stream hard, the impact driving all the air from my lungs and sending shockwaves of pain through my legs and back. My pack probably saved my life, cushioning some of the impact, but I still felt something crack in my ribs as I hit the rocky bottom. Above me, the Wendigo was pacing back and forth at the edge of the ravine, clearly trying to decide whether to risk the jump itself. After a moment, it let out a howl of frustration and disappeared back into the trees. I lay in the shallow stream for several minutes, taking inventory of my injuries. My ribs were definitely cracked, maybe broken, and my left ankle felt like it might be sprained. But I was alive, and for the moment, I was safe. The stream would lead me out of this nightmare forest eventually. All streams led somewhere, and somewhere was better than here. I struggled to my feet, using a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch, and began following the water downstream. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to keep moving. The Wendigo was still out there, and it would be looking for another way down to the stream bed. I limped through the forest for hours, following the winding course of the stream as it gradually grew wider and faster. The sun was starting to set again when I finally heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distant hum of traffic on a highway. The stream led me to a concrete culvert that passed under State Route 37. I crawled up the embankment to the road, my clothes soaked and torn, my body screaming with pain, but alive. A state police cruiser stopped for me 20 minutes later. The trooper took one look at my condition and called for an ambulance, but I insisted on giving my statement right there on the side of the road. "My friend Brian Wright is missing," I told him. "We were camping in Hoosier National Forest and he disappeared during the night. Something attacked us. Something that looked like him but wasn't him. The trooper wrote everything down, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Search and rescue teams combed the forest for 3 days, but they never found any trace of Brian. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead from exposure or animal attack. They never found our campsite either, or any sign that we'd ever been in that part of the forest. The broken flashlight I'd carried with me was the only physical evidence that any of it had happened. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from my injuries. The doctors said I was lucky. The broken ribs had come close to puncturing a lung, and the sprain in my ankle was severe enough that I'd probably have a permanent limp. But the physical injuries healed. The other damage, that's going to take a lot longer. I still have nightmares about that thing wearing Brian's face, about the way it smiled when it talked about eating me. I wake up in cold sweats, checking the locks on my apartment door, knowing that locked doors wouldn't stop something like that if it really wanted to get in. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear scratching at my windows. When I look outside, there's never anything there, but I can feel eyes watching me from the darkness between the streetlights. The worst part is the uncertainty. Is it dead? Did the fall into the ravine kill it, or just inconvenience it? And if it's still alive, is it still hungry? Still looking for me? I've thought about moving, starting over somewhere far away from Indiana. But I have the feeling that distance wouldn't matter to something like that. If it wants me, it will find me eventually. So I wait, and I watch, and I try not to think about the way Brian's face looked in those final moments, distorted by hunger and something deeper, something that had been sleeping in the dark places of the world for far too long. The one thing I know for certain is that I'll never go camping again. Some experiences change you in ways you can't come back from, and some things you see can't be unseen. The forest is still out there, and somewhere in its depths, something that was once my best friend is still hunting, still hungry, and it remembers my scent. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote depths of Hoosier National Forest in southern Indiana, where the ancient trees grow so thick that daylight struggles to penetrate their canopy even at noon. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just 4 co-workers from the accounting firm trying to bond outside the sterile confines of our downtown Indianapolis office. Jennifer Davis had suggested it during one of our coffee breaks, her enthusiasm infectious as she spread a wrinkled map across the break room table. "Look, there's this spot near Hickory Ridge Trail," she'd said, her finger tracing a remote section of the forest. "My uncle used to hunt there. Said it was peaceful, untouched." Robert Johnson had been skeptical from the start, his weathered face creased with doubt. At 47, he was the oldest among us, a divorced father who spent most weekends with his teenage son. "Why not just hit up Turkey Run or something closer?" he'd grumbled, but we'd worn him down. Sarah Rodriguez, our youngest at 26, had sealed the deal with her infectious optimism. "Come on, Bob, when's the last time you did something spontaneous?" Now, as I write this with shaking hands 3 days later, I wish we'd listened to Robert's caution. We left Friday evening after work, Jennifer's SUV packed with enough gear for a modest expedition. The drive south took us through rolling farmland that gradually gave way to dense woodland. By the time we reached the Forest Service road that would take us to our campsite, the sun had dipped below the tree line, casting everything in an amber twilight that felt both beautiful and ominous. The gravel road twisted through corridors of towering oak and maple, their branches creating a tunnel overhead. Our headlights carved through the growing darkness, illuminating brief glimpses of the wilderness beyond. Fallen logs covered in luminescent fungi, the occasional pair of eyes reflecting back at us from the underbrush. "GPS says we're almost there," Jennifer announced, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. The device on her dashboard had been acting strangely for the past 10 miles, showing our location jumping erratically across the screen before losing signal altogether. "Maybe we should have brought an actual map," Robert muttered from the passenger seat. "Technology's great until it isn't." Sarah laughed from beside me in the back. "You sound like my grandfather. Next, you'll be telling us to bring a compass and a sextant." But even her usual levity seemed forced, as if the oppressive darkness pressing against our windows was affecting us all. We found the trailhead exactly where Jennifer's uncle had described it. A small clearing with a rusted sign marking the Hickory Ridge Trail. The parking area was empty, which wasn't surprising given how remote the location was. According to the Forest Service information, this section of trail saw maybe a dozen hikers per month, mostly serious backpackers seeking solitude. Unloading our gear by flashlight, we shouldered our packs and began the 2-mile hike to the campsite Jennifer's uncle had recommended. The trail was well maintained but narrow, forcing us to walk single file. Jennifer took the lead, her headlamp cutting through the darkness ahead. I followed, then Sarah, with Robert bringing up the rear. The forest at night was alive with sounds. The rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the soft whisper of wind through leaves. But there was something else, a quality to the silence between sounds that felt expectant, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Jesus, it's quiet out here," Sarah whispered after we'd been walking for about 30 minutes. Her voice seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Good," Jennifer replied, though I noticed she'd unconsciously quickened her pace. "That's the point. No traffic, no sirens, no office noise, just nature." But it wasn't just quiet. It was the wrong kind of quiet. I'd been camping before, and wilderness nights usually hummed with insect life, the calls of nocturnal animals, the subtle sounds of a living ecosystem. This felt different, muffled, as if something was actively suppressing the natural chorus. We reached the campsite around 9:30. It was a small clearing beside a creek that babbled softly over smooth stones. Jennifer's uncle had been right. It was beautiful, with a natural fire ring already established and enough flat ground for our tents. We set up camp efficiently, our headlamps creating overlapping cones of light that made the surrounding trees loom like silent sentinels. "Fire first, then food," Robert declared, taking charge with the kind of practical authority that made him valuable at work. He'd brought his own firewood, seasoned oak from his backyard, not trusting the forest to provide dry fuel after recent rains. But the fire wouldn't catch. Robert was an experienced outdoorsman. He'd been camping since he was a Boy Scout, but the kindling kept refusing to ignite. The matches flared and died. The lighter fluid burned off without catching the wood, and even Sarah's emergency fire starter cubes seemed to sputter and fade against the stubborn logs. "Must be the humidity," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. The air felt dry, almost electrically charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. On the 7th try, the fire finally caught, but the flames burned an odd orange-blue color that made our faces look corpse-pale in its light. We attributed it to Jennifer's uncle's choice of firewood, but the sight made my stomach clench with inexplicable unease. Dinner was freeze-dried camping food heated over our portable stove. The strange fire made us reluctant to cook over it directly. We ate mostly in silence, the usual workplace banter replaced by a shared sense of unease none of us wanted to acknowledge. Every snap of a twig in the darkness beyond our circle of light made us tense. Every owl call sounded unnaturally harsh. Sarah kept checking her phone, frowning at the dead screen. "That's weird," she muttered. "Battery was full when we started. Now it won't even turn on." "Mine too," Jennifer added, fishing her device from her pocket. The screen remained black despite her attempts to power it on. Robert chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Guess the forest's telling us to unplug. Isn't that what we wanted?" I checked my own phone and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Not only was it dead, but the metal casing felt unnaturally cold, almost burning against my palm. I dropped it quickly and heard Sarah gasp. She'd apparently experienced the same thing. "Okay, that's officially creepy," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. We tried to laugh it off, blamed it on the cold or some kind of electromagnetic interference from the forest geology. But privately, I was beginning to feel that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The trees seemed to lean inward around our campsite, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. The fire continued to burn, that sickly blue-orange, casting dancing shadows that looked almost like figures moving just beyond the light. By 10:30, we'd retreated to our tents. Jennifer and Sarah shared a two-person dome tent they'd borrowed from Jennifer's sister, while Robert and I had our own individual shelters. The plan was to wake early and hike to the ridge overlook, then spend Saturday exploring some of the side trails Jennifer's uncle had recommended. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the unnatural quiet, punctuated occasionally by a sound that might have been wind but felt more deliberate, more purposeful. Sometime around midnight I heard Sarah's voice from the adjacent tent, speaking in low, urgent whispers to Jennifer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was fearful, almost panicked. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. A sound like footsteps circling our campsite, but not quite human footsteps. They were too measured, too purposeful, with an odd sliding quality as if whatever was making them wasn't entirely accustomed to walking upright. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sounds faded into the general silence of the forest. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of pale figures moving between dark trees. I woke to Jennifer's scream. Gray dawn light filtered through my tent walls, and I could hear her shouting something about Sarah. I unzipped my tent and stumbled outside to find Jennifer standing by their collapsed tent, her face white with terror. "She's gone!" Jennifer gasped, pointing at the tent. Her sleeping bag is empty, but it's unzipped from the inside, like she just left in the middle of the night. Robert emerged from his tent, his graying hair disheveled. "What do you mean, gone?" "Sarah. She's not here. Her sleeping bag, her backpack, everything's gone except—" Jennifer's voice trailed off as she pointed to something on the ground beside the tent. Sarah's shoes. Both of them, sitting side by side as if she'd simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into the forest. "She wouldn't leave without her shoes," I said, stating the obvious. "Not out here." Robert was already examining the ground around our campsite, looking for tracks or signs of struggle. "No footprints leading away," he announced grimly. "Just these weird marks, like something was dragged, but not quite." The marks he indicated were strange. Long, shallow gouges in the earth that could have been made by fingernails or claws, leading from the tent toward the tree line before vanishing entirely. "We need to find her," Jennifer said, her voice cracking. "She could be hurt, lost, hypothermic." But even as she spoke, we heard Sarah's voice calling from the forest, distant but clear. "Help me, I'm over here." We grabbed our gear and followed the voice deeper into the woods, past the marked trail and into sections of forest that felt increasingly ancient and untouched. The trees here were massive, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter, their canopy so thick that it felt like walking through a living cathedral. Sarah's voice called out periodically, always seeming to come from just ahead, just out of sight. But there was something wrong with it, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. The tone was right, the words were right, but there was an odd quality to the sound, as if it was being projected from a great distance or filtered through something that didn't quite understand human speech. "Sarah!" Jennifer called back, her voice echoing off the tree trunks. "Where are you? Are you hurt?" "I'm here," came the reply, but now it seemed to come from behind us. We spun around, disoriented, and realized we were thoroughly lost. The dense canopy had hidden the sun's position, and in our panic to find Sarah, we'd neglected to mark our path. "Shit," Robert muttered, pulling out his compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. This thing's never failed me before. We spent the morning calling for Sarah and trying to find our way back to camp, growing increasingly desperate and disoriented. The forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks changing when we weren't looking directly at them. It was as if the woods themselves were alive and malevolent, deliberately confusing us. Around noon, we finally heard Sarah's voice clearly, coming from a clearing about 50 yards ahead. But when we reached the spot, we found something that made my stomach drop. It was our campsite. Somehow, after hours of wandering, we'd come full circle. Our tents stood exactly as we'd left them, the cold ashes of our strange fire still in the ring. But sitting beside the fire, as if she'd never left, was Sarah. She looked up as we approached and smiled. "There you are. I was wondering where everyone went." Jennifer rushed forward and grabbed her in a fierce hug. "Sarah! Oh my God, we were so worried. Where were you? We looked everywhere." Sarah's smile never wavered, but something about it was wrong. It was too wide, held too long, like someone who'd learned to smile by watching others but didn't quite understand when to stop. "I went for a walk," she said simply. "Got turned around for a bit." "A walk?" Robert's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Barefoot? You left your shoes by the tent." Sarah looked down at her feet, which were clean and unmarked despite supposedly walking through miles of forest floor. "Oh," she said and laughed. The sound was exactly like Sarah's laugh, but it seemed to echo strangely, lasting a beat too long. I guess I forgot them. Something cold was spreading through my chest, a primal recognition that something was deeply wrong. This looked like Sarah. Same height, same build, same auburn hair and green eyes, but there were subtle differences that my mind struggled to process. She blinked too infrequently. Her breathing seemed unnaturally controlled, and when she turned her head, there was a jerky, mechanical quality to the movement, like a marionette being operated by someone still learning how to work the strings. "Sarah," I said carefully, "do you remember what we were talking about last night, before we went to sleep?" Her eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment I saw something looking back that definitely wasn't Sarah. Something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. Then she smiled again, that too wide smile, and said, "We talked about many things, Michael. Could you be more specific?" But we hadn't talked about many things. In fact, we'd barely talked at all before retreating to our tents. The real Sarah would have remembered the strange events of the evening. The phones dying, the weird fire, the unnatural silence. She would have been shaken, probably scared. This thing wearing Sarah's face showed no sign of fear or confusion. Jennifer didn't seem to notice anything amiss, relief making her blind to the subtle wrongness. But I caught Robert's eye and saw my own suspicions reflected there. He'd noticed too. "Well," Jennifer said brightly, "as long as you're okay, should we pack up and head home? This place is giving me the creeps." "Oh, no," Sarah said, and her voice carried a note of authority that the real Sarah had never possessed. "We should stay. The forest has so much to show us." As she spoke, I noticed her fingernails. They were longer than they'd been yesterday and darker, with what looked like soil caked underneath them. But it wasn't soil. It was something else, something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of mounting tension. Sarah, or the thing that looked like Sarah, seemed determined to keep us in the forest. Every suggestion to leave was met with resistance, with logical-sounding arguments about why we should stay another night. She wanted to explore the ridge trail, she said. We'd come all this way, we shouldn't waste the opportunity. But her behavior grew increasingly disturbing as the day wore on. She would stand perfectly still for long periods, head tilted at an unnatural angle as if listening to sounds only she could hear. When she moved, it was with an odd, predatory grace that reminded me of a hunting cat. And her appetite. She consumed twice as much food as the rest of us combined, eating with mechanical efficiency while staring into the forest with those two bright eyes. Robert pulled me aside when Sarah and Jennifer went to refill our water bottles at the creek. "That's not her," he said quietly, his face grim. "I don't know what happened to the real Sarah, but that thing is not our co-worker." I nodded, relief flooding through me at having my fears confirmed. "What do? We get the hell out of here. tonight while it's sleeping." He glanced toward the creek where Sarah's laughter rang out, too loud and too sharp. "And we don't let on that we know." But our plan fell apart almost immediately. As soon as we tried to suggest leaving, Sarah became agitated, her carefully maintained human facade beginning to slip. Her movements became more erratic, her smile more forced. "But we can't leave yet," she insisted, and her voice had developed an odd harmonic quality, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "The forest isn't finished with us." Jennifer finally began to notice that something was wrong. "Sarah, are you feeling okay? You seem different." Sarah's head snapped toward Jennifer with inhuman speed, and for a moment her face was completely alien, features shifting and blurring as if her human appearance was just a mask that was slipping. Then the expression normalized, and she was Sarah again, looking hurt and confused. "I'm fine," she said. "Why would you say that?" But the damage was done. We all saw it, that moment when the mask fell away and revealed something else underneath. Something that had been wearing Sarah's face like a costume, learning to be human through observation and mimicry, but not quite getting it right. Night fell with unnatural speed, as if the forest was eager for darkness. We built another fire. Normal flames this time, though they seemed to provide little warmth or comfort. Sarah sat across from us, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of humanity. She stared at us with predatory intensity, occasionally tilting her head to listen to sounds we couldn't hear. "Where is she?" Jennifer asked suddenly, her voice small and frightened. "Where's the real Sarah?" The thing wearing Sarah's face smiled, and this time it didn't bother to make the expression look human. The smile was too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, and it stretched the skin of her face in ways that should have been impossible. "Sarah is here," it said in a voice that was no longer even attempting to match our friend's tone. "Sarah is everywhere. In the trees, in the earth, in the hungry spaces between heartbeats." Robert had quietly moved to position himself between the creature and our gear, his hand resting on the handle of his camping knife. "What are you?" he demanded. "Hungry," it replied simply. "So very hungry. It's been decades since travelers came this deep into our territory. Decades since we tasted fresh meat." The woods around us erupted with sound, the crack of breaking branches, the rustle of massive bodies moving through the underbrush. More shapes emerged from the darkness beyond our fire, humanoid but wrong, their proportions subtly distorted. They moved with the same predatory grace as the Sarah thing, and their eyes reflected the firelight like those of nocturnal animals. "Wendigo," Robert breathed, recognition dawning on his face. "Jesus Christ, they're Wendigo." The creatures, there had to be at least a dozen of them, formed a loose circle around our campsite. Up close, their human disguises were even more obviously false. They wore the faces of people, but the expressions never quite matched their words. And their movements were all wrong, too fluid in some places and too rigid in others. "Your friend was delicious," the Sarah thing said conversationally. "Panic makes the meat tender, and she was so very afraid when we found her wandering alone in the dark. But don't worry, we saved some for you." It gestured to one of the other creatures, which stepped forward carrying something that made Jennifer scream and Robert curse. It was Sarah's severed head, the eyes wide with terror, the mouth frozen open in a silent scream. But even worse was what they'd done to her body. I could see gnawed bones and torn flesh in the shadows beyond the firelight. The Wendigo had been feeding. Jennifer was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face. Robert had drawn his knife, though against a dozen supernatural predators it would be useless. I found myself paralyzed with terror, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "The thing about mimicry," the Sarah creature continued, "is that it requires practice. Your friend's memories, her mannerisms, her voice, we absorbed all of it when we consumed her. But we're still learning, still hungry." One of the other Wendigos spoke, its voice a harsh whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The fear is best." The moment when prey realizes it cannot escape, when hope dies, that's when the meat becomes perfect. They were playing with us, I realized. They could have killed us already, but they were savoring our terror, feeding on it as much as they would feed on our flesh. These creatures had perfected psychological torture, understanding that fear made their prey more satisfying. "Run," Robert said quietly, his voice steady despite the hopelessness of our situation. "When I give the signal, run toward the trail. Don't look back." But there was nowhere to run. The Wendigo had us surrounded, and they moved through the forest like they owned it. We were 3 humans with camping gear against a pack of ancient predators in their own territory. The attack came without warning. Robert lunged at the Seraphim with his knife, and the creature's human facade finally dropped completely. Its face elongated into something lupine, its fingers stretched into claws, and it moved with inhuman speed. Robert's blade caught it across the shoulder, drawing black blood, but it backhanded him across the clearing with such force that I heard bones break when he hit a tree trunk. Jennifer tried to run, but one of the other Wendigo caught her easily, its claws raking across her back and sending her tumbling to the ground. She screamed as it pinned her down, its elongated jaws opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it wildly, the flames causing the nearest creature to hiss and retreat. Fire. They were afraid of fire. I seized on this knowledge, thrusting the makeshift torch at any Wendigo that came too close. "The fire!" I shouted to Jennifer, who was struggling beneath her attacker. "They don't like fire!" Jennifer managed to kick free and grab another burning branch, waving it frantically to keep the creatures at bay. But there were too many of them, and our improvised weapons wouldn't last long. Robert wasn't moving. Blood pooled beneath his head, and his chest rose and fell with irregular, labored breaths. The Wendigo were closing in again, more cautious now but still confident in their superior numbers. The Sarah creature approached, its wound already healing with supernatural speed. "Fire won't save you," it said, its voice now a guttural growl. "We've been hunting in these woods since before your people learned to make flame. We know its limitations." It was right. The branches were burning down quickly, and once our makeshift torches went out, we'd be helpless. But I noticed something that gave me a desperate idea. Our camping stove, still connected to its fuel canister. I lunged for it, dodging claws that whistled past my head, and managed to grab both the stove and Robert's lighter fluid. The Wendigo pounced as I twisted the gas valve wide open and squeezed the trigger on the lighter fluid, creating a stream of flammable liquid that ignited into a crude flamethrower. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Wendigo shrieked and scattered as the improvised weapon sent a jet of flame across the clearing. The Sarah creature took the full blast across its chest and face, its stolen human features melting away to reveal something far worse underneath. Ancient, starved, utterly inhuman. "Jennifer, go!" I screamed, maintaining the flame jet as long as the fuel lasted. "Get to the trail." She didn't need to be told twice. Jennifer ran for the tree line while I held the Wendigo at bay with my rapidly depleting weapon. When the lighter fluid ran out, I tossed the still-burning stove at the nearest creature and grabbed our emergency flare gun from Robert's pack. The red flare caught the Sarah creature in the abdomen, the burning phosphorus eating through its stolen flesh like acid. It screamed, a sound like breaking glass and grinding bone, and collapsed, writhing to the ground. I fired our second and final flare into the group of Wendigo, then grabbed Jennifer's abandoned pack and ran. Behind me, I could hear them regrouping, their inhuman voices calling to each other in a language that predated human speech. I caught up with Jennifer on the trail, both of us running blindly through the darkness. We had no flashlights, no compass, no way to navigate except by following the narrow path and hoping it led back to our car. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, branches breaking, claws scraping against bark, and that horrible chittering language as the pack coordinated their hunt. We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling over roots and rocks, our lungs burning with exhaustion. Several times I thought I heard Wendigo moving parallel to the trail, shadowing our flight, but somehow we stayed ahead of them, Maybe the fire had hurt them worse than they'd let on. Or maybe they were just toying with us, letting us think we could escape before closing in for the kill. Finally, impossibly, we saw the glow of a street lamp through the trees. The parking area. Our salvation. Jennifer's SUV sat where we'd left it, covered in dew but intact. She fumbled for her keys with shaking hands while I watched the tree line for signs of pursuit. The forest had gone quiet again, but it was the expectant silence of predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The engine turned over on the first try, and we reversed out of the parking space so fast we almost hit a tree. Jennifer drove like a madwoman down the winding Forest Service road, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, neither of us speaking until we reached the main highway. It was only then, in the safety of traffic and streetlights, that we began to process what had happened. Sarah was dead, torn apart and consumed by creatures that shouldn't exist. Robert was probably dead too, if he hadn't been already when we fled. And we were the only witnesses to something that no one would ever believe. We drove straight to the nearest hospital, where doctors treated our cuts and scratches while we gave carefully edited statements to the police. We said our friends had been attacked by wild animals, possibly bears or a pack of feral dogs. The authorities organized a search and rescue operation, but they never found any trace of Robert or Sarah, not even bones. The official report blamed the incident on an unusually aggressive black bear, possibly rabid. The deaths were ruled accidental, and the area around Hickory Ridge Trail was temporarily closed to hikers. It reopened 6 months later with additional warning signs about wildlife dangers. Jennifer quit her job and moved to California. We exchanged a few emails, but talking about what happened brought back too many memories, too much trauma. Eventually, we stopped communicating altogether. I stayed in Indianapolis but found a new job. I couldn't handle being in the same office where Sarah used to sit, where her cheerful voice once filled our coffee breaks with talk of weekend adventures. Sometimes I catch myself listening for that voice, then remember what had been wearing her face in those final hours. I still have nightmares about the Wendigo. In my dreams, I'm back in that clearing, watching the Sarah creature smile with too many teeth while the real Sarah's head stares at me with accusing eyes. I wake up checking my phone, making sure it still works, that I'm still connected to the human world and not lost in some supernatural pocket where ancient hungers wait patiently for travelers who wander too far from civilization. The official reports say that Sarah Rodriguez and Robert Johnson died in an animal attack while camping in Hoosier National Forest. But I know the truth. They were murdered and eaten by creatures that have been hunting in those woods since long before Indiana was even a state. Wendigo that have learned to mimic human form well enough to lure prey into their territory. And sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and the darkness presses against my windows, I wonder if they're still out there, still hungry, still wearing the faces of their victims and practicing human speech while they wait for the next group of unwary campers to venture too deep into their domain. I'll never go camping again. The wilderness isn't peaceful or pristine or healing like the nature documentaries claim. It's full of old hungers and ancient malevolence, things that see humans not as fellow inhabitants of the earth but as prey to be stalked, terrorized, and consumed. The Wendigo are still out there, in the deep places where cell phones don't work and GPS signals fail. They're patient creatures. My name is Michael Williams and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Charles C. Deem Wilderness area of the Hoosier National Forest in Indiana, 3 miles north of the old Hickory Ridge Fire Tower, near a place locals call Blackwater Creek. I should have listened to the warnings. The 4 of us, myself, Trevor Walsh, Jennifer Martinez, and Sarah Robinson, had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd all been college roommates at Indiana University, and even though we'd scattered across the Midwest after graduation, we made it a point to reunite every October for what we called our annual escape from civilization. This year marked our 5th trip together, and we'd grown increasingly ambitious with our destinations. Trevor, always the overachiever, had discovered the remote camping spot through his obsessive research on backpacking forums. "It's perfect," he'd explained over our planning video call, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the glow of his laptop screen. "Completely off the beaten path, no marked trails leading to it. You have to bushwhack about 2 miles from the nearest parking area at Tower Ridge Road. The forum posts say there's a natural clearing beside Blackwater Creek with established fire rings, but barely anyone knows about it." Jennifer, our eternal optimist and former environmental science major, had been immediately sold. "I love that we'll have the place completely to ourselves. No screaming kids or RV generators." Her enthusiasm was infectious, as always. Sarah, the practical one among us, had voiced the only concern. "Are we sure we can find this place? What if we get lost?" She worked as an accountant now, and her need for detailed planning hadn't diminished since college. I'd been the tiebreaker, ultimately agreeing because I trusted Trevor's navigation skills and because, honestly, I needed a break from the suffocating routine of my marketing job in Indianapolis. The idea of genuine isolation appealed to me more than I cared to admit. Now, standing at the edge of that clearing as dusk approached on our first evening, I wondered if Sarah's concerns had been more prescient than any of us realized. The spot itself was undeniably beautiful. A roughly circular clearing about 40 feet across, surrounded by towering oak and hickory trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. Blackwater Creek gurgled along the eastern edge, its water running surprisingly dark despite the clear weather we'd enjoyed all week. The established fire ring sat in the center of the clearing, blackened stones arranged in a perfect circle with the remnants of previous campfires evident in the ash pile within. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it initially. Maybe it was the way the forest seemed unusually quiet as we set up our tents, devoid of the typical bird songs and rustling wildlife sounds we'd grown accustomed to during our previous trips. Or perhaps it was the smell. Underneath the pleasant autumn scent of decomposing leaves, there was something else. Something sour and organic that reminded me unpleasantly of the time I'd discovered a dead raccoon in my garage. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered as she struggled with her tent poles. She was setting up her small 2-person tent about 10 feet from the fire ring, while Trevor and I worked on our shared 4-person shelter nearby. "It's just because it's getting dark," Jennifer called from across the clearing, where she was already efficiently organizing her gear beside her tent. "You know how these forests look different once the sun goes down." Trevor laughed, but I noticed he kept glancing toward the tree line as he worked. "Come on, Sarah. We specifically wanted isolated. This is what isolated looks like." I was driving my tent stakes into the surprisingly hard ground when I heard it, a sound like breaking branches coming from deep in the forest to our north. We all froze. "Probably just a deer," Trevor said after a moment, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The sound came again, closer this time. Not the random snapping of an animal moving through underbrush, but something more deliberate, almost rhythmic. "Big deer," Jennifer said, attempting levity, but I could see her gripping her tent stake hammer a little tighter. The sounds stopped as abruptly as they'd begun, leaving us in the kind of complete silence that makes your ears ring. Even the creek seemed to have quieted, its earlier cheerful babbling reduced to barely audible whispers. "We should get a fire going," I suggested, eager to break the tension. "It'll be full dark soon." The fire proved surprisingly difficult to start. Despite the dry conditions and the seasoned wood Trevor had insisted we bring from home, the kindling refused to catch properly. When flames finally began to take hold, they burned with an odd blue-green tinge that none of us could explain. "Copper in the wood, maybe?" Trevor suggested, but he sounded uncertain. As full darkness settled over the clearing, the temperature seemed to drop more dramatically than the weather forecast had predicted. We huddled around our strangely colored fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey Trevor had smuggled in his pack, trying to recapture the easy camaraderie that had characterized our previous trips. "Remember that storm in Brown County?" Jennifer said, clearly making an effort to lighten the mood. "When we had to ride it out in that old ranger station?" We'd laughed about that experience for years, how we'd been caught by an unexpected thunderstorm during our second annual trip and had to take shelter in an abandoned fire tower. We'd spent the night huddled together, telling ghost stories and eating the emergency granola bars from our packs. "At least we had cell service there," Sarah pointed out. She'd been trying her phone periodically since we'd arrived, growing increasingly frustrated with the complete lack of signal. "That's kind of the point," Trevor reminded her. "We wanted to disconnect." But even as he said it, I could see him checking his own phone. The GPS had been acting strangely during our hike-in, showing our location jumping erratically across the screen before finally giving up and displaying a generic "location not available" message. Around 10 o'clock, we heard the sounds again. This time, they seemed to come from multiple directions. The same deliberate branch breaking, but echoing from the east, then the south, then circling around to the west. As if something was moving around the perimeter of our clearing, just beyond the reach of our firelight. "What kind of animal does that?" Sarah whispered. None of us had an answer. Trevor, ever the Eagle Scout, suggested we take turns keeping watch. "Just to be safe," he said, but I could see the genuine concern in his eyes. 2-hour shifts. I'll take first watch with Michael." Jennifer and Sarah retreated to their tents, but I could tell neither was likely to sleep. Their tent zippers kept opening and closing, and I could hear quiet whispered conversations from both shelters. Trevor and I sat beside the fire, feeding it fresh wood to keep the flames high. The strange coloring had faded, but the fire still seemed to burn with less light than it should have, as if the darkness around us was somehow denser than normal. "Have you ever heard of anything like this?" I asked quietly. Trevor shook his head. "The sounds? No. But—" He hesitated. "When I was researching this place, I found some forum posts that were kind of weird. Deleted posts mostly, but Google had cached a few. People talking about bad experiences in this general area. Nothing specific, just bad feelings, equipment failures." As if on cue, my headlamp flickered and died. I'd charged it fully before the trip and had only used it for about 20 minutes during our evening setup. "Mike," Trevor said softly, "look at the creek." I followed his gaze to where Blackwater Creek flowed along the edge of our clearing. The water, which had been running consistently since our arrival, had stopped moving. The surface was now perfectly still, reflecting our firelight like black glass. "Streams don't just stop flowing," I said. "No," Trevor agreed. "They don't." We sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence, feeding wood to our fire and trying not to look toward the motionless water. The sounds from the forest had stopped entirely, but somehow that was worse than the mysterious branch breaking. The silence felt expectant, like the moment before a thunderclap. Around midnight, Jennifer's tent zipper opened. "I can't sleep," she announced quietly. "Something about this place. It's like there's electricity in the air." She joined us by the fire, wrapping her sleeping bag around her shoulders. In the flickering light, her usually cheerful face looked drawn and exhausted. "Maybe we should leave in the morning," she suggested. "Find somewhere else to camp." Trevor bristled. "We hiked 2 miles to get here, and for what? Some weird animal sounds?" "The creek isn't flowing, Trevor," I pointed out. "So there's a blockage upstream, a fallen tree or something. These things have natural explanations." But even as he argued, I could see doubt in his expression. This was Trevor trying to convince himself as much as us. At 2 in the morning, we woke Sarah for her watch shift. She emerged from her tent looking haggard, her blonde hair matted with sweat despite the cool air. "I heard voices," she said without preamble, "in my tent. Quiet voices like whispers, but I couldn't make out words." Jennifer and I exchanged glances. I'd been hearing something similar for the past hour, subtle sounds that might have been wind through leaves, but which seemed to carry the rhythm of conversation. "You're taking the next watch with Jennifer," Trevor announced. "I don't want anyone alone out here." We tried to maintain normal conversation during Sarah and Jennifer's watch, but the atmosphere in our camp had shifted fundamentally. Where we'd always been comfortable with each other's silences, now every pause in conversation felt loaded with unspoken anxiety. The fire began to die down around 3:30, despite the pile of wood we'd stacked nearby. When Jennifer tried to add fresh logs, they wouldn't catch. The flames grew smaller and smaller until we were left with just glowing embers that provided almost no light. "This isn't right," Sarah said flatly. "Fire doesn't behave like this." We tried everything: newspaper, dry bark, even a small amount of the whiskey as an accelerant. Nothing worked. The embers glowed weakly for another half hour before dying completely, leaving us in absolute darkness. Without the fire, the temperature seemed to plummet. Our breath became visible in the cold air, and frost began forming on the outside of our tents despite the fact that the weather report had called for overnight lows in the 50s. "We need to stick together," Trevor's voice came from the darkness. "Nobody goes anywhere alone." We spent the rest of the night huddled together in Trevor's and my tent, 4 adults crammed into a space designed for 2, fully clothed in our sleeping bags, listening to sounds that defied explanation. Footsteps that circled our campsite for hours without ever approaching. Whispers in a language none of us recognized. And underneath it all, a sound like breathing, slow, labored inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the earth itself. Dawn came with unnatural suddenness. One moment we were lying in complete darkness, and the next, gray morning light was filtering through the tent walls. The temperature had returned to normal, and I could hear Blackwater Creek flowing again. "Thank God," Jennifer whispered. We emerged from the tent to find our campsite fundamentally changed. The circle of stones that had formed the fire ring was gone entirely, leaving only bare earth. Our carefully organized gear was scattered across the clearing as if by a strong wind, though I couldn't remember feeling even a breeze during the night. Most disturbing, there were tracks in the soft earth around our tents. Not animal tracks, these were human footprints, but wrong somehow. Too long, with elongated toes that ended in what looked like claw marks. "We're leaving," Sarah announced. "Right now." For once, Trevor didn't argue. We broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into our packs without our usual careful organization. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching us from the tree line, but the forest appeared empty. The hike out should have taken 2 hours. We'd marked our route carefully on the way in, and Trevor had his compass and GPS coordinates for the parking area. But after walking for what felt like much longer than 2 hours, we found ourselves back at Blackwater Creek. "This is impossible," Trevor said, studying his compass with increasing frustration. "We've been walking due south for over an hour. We should have hit Tower Ridge Road by now." We tried a different direction, then another. Each time, after walking for what seemed like the correct distance, we'd find ourselves back at the creek, approaching from a different angle but unmistakably in the same location. The sun was directly overhead when we made a discovery that made Sarah start crying. There, sitting beside the creek exactly where our campfire had been the night before, was our missing gear. The scattered equipment we'd hastily packed that morning was laid out in neat, organized piles. Our tents were set up again, precisely as they'd been when we'd first arrived. "This isn't happening," Jennifer said, but her voice was shaky. Trevor grabbed his pack and started pulling out gear, checking contents. "Someone's messing with us," he insisted. "There are other people out here, and they're playing some kind of sick joke." But even as he said it, I could see he didn't believe it. The logistics alone were impossible. When could other campers have set up our tents without us noticing? We'd been together constantly since breaking camp. "We need to think about this logically," I said, though I was struggling to maintain calm myself. "Maybe we're disoriented. Maybe we've been walking in circles without realizing it." "For 4 hours?" Sarah demanded through her tears. "We've tried every direction. Michael, every single direction brings us back here." As if to emphasize her point, Trevor's GPS unit chose that moment to power on spontaneously. The screen showed our location as a pulsing dot in the middle of what appeared to be empty space. No trails, no roads, no landmarks within a 50-mile radius. The batteries were dead, Trevor said quietly. I checked them this morning. They were completely dead. We were trapped. The afternoon passed in a haze of repeated escape attempts and growing desperation. We tried following the creek downstream, reasoning that it had to connect to a larger waterway eventually. After 3 miles of hiking through increasingly difficult terrain, the creek simply ended at a rock wall, as if the water disappeared into the ground. We tried upstream with the same result. We tried climbing the tallest trees to get our bearings, but the canopy was too thick to see any landmarks. We tried making noise to attract potential rescuers, though we knew how unlikely it was that anyone else was within miles. As evening approached, we faced the terrifying reality that we were spending another night in this place. We'll take shorter watches, Trevor announced as we sat around another reluctantly started fire, 30-minute shifts. And nobody leaves the light of the fire for any reason. The fire burned normally this time, but the flames seemed to create more shadows than light, casting dancing shapes across the tree line that looked almost like figures moving between the trunks. Around 9 o'clock, we heard the first voice. Michael. Clear as day, coming from the forest to our east. A woman's voice, unfamiliar, but somehow compelling. Don't, Jennifer warned as I started to stand. Don't even think about it. The voice came again, closer. Michael, we need your help. It's not real, Sarah said firmly. Whatever's out there, it's not real. But it sounded real. It sounded like someone in genuine distress, calling for assistance from just beyond the reach of our firelight. The voice was joined by others. Trevor's name, called from the south. Jennifer's name from the west. Sarah's from the north. All in different voices, all pleading for help, all maddeningly just out of sight. It's trying to separate us, Trevor said. Whatever this is, it wants us alone. We moved our chairs closer together, forming a tight circle around the fire. The voices continued for hours, sometimes calling our names, sometimes having conversations among themselves. I could swear I heard my mother's voice at one point, telling me she was lost and needed me to come find her. The hardest part was that every instinct in my body screamed at me to respond, to go help whoever was calling. It took every ounce of willpower to remain seated. Around 11, the voices stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was almost worse than the calling had been. Maybe it's over, Jennifer whispered hopefully. Then we heard footsteps. Not the circling steps from the previous night, but direct, purposeful movement toward our campfire. Heavy footfalls that seemed to shake the ground with each impact. A figure emerged from the tree line to our north. At first glance, it looked like a man. Tall, thin, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing. But as it moved closer to our fire, the details became wronger with each step. Too tall. At least 7 feet, with arms that hung too low and legs that seemed to bend at odd angles. The face was obscured by shadow, but I could see pale skin that looked waxy and unnatural in the firelight. Nobody move, Trevor whispered. The figure stopped at the edge of our light, just close enough for us to see it clearly. What I'd taken for dark clothing was actually matted fur or hair covering most of its body. Its hands ended in fingers that were too long, tipped with black claws that caught the firelight. But it was the smell that finally broke Sarah's composure. The same sour, organic odor we'd noticed upon arriving, but magnified 100-fold. The smell of death and decay and something fundamentally wrong. Sarah screamed. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the creature motionless. It tilted its head with a movement that was too quick, too sharp, and opened its mouth. Rows of yellowed teeth filled a mouth that was too wide, and when it spoke, the voice was a perfect imitation of Sarah's own. "Help me," it said in her voice. "Please, help me." Then it smiled, and I saw that its teeth were stained with something dark. Trevor grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it at the creature. The makeshift torch struck it center mass and bounced off harmlessly, but the sudden motion seemed to startle it back a step. "The tents!" Jennifer gasped. "Get to the tents!" We scrambled backward, never taking our eyes off the figure. It watched us with what might have been amusement, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. In our panic to reach shelter, we didn't notice that Sarah wasn't with us until we were already inside Trevor's tent with the zipper pulled closed. "Where's Sarah?" I demanded. We peered through the tent's mesh window. Sarah was still sitting by the fire, perfectly motionless, staring at the creature. Her face was blank, expressionless, as if she were sleepwalking. "Sarah!" Jennifer called. "Sarah, get in here!" Our friend didn't respond. She continued sitting, unmoving, while the creature began to walk slowly around the fire, never breaking eye contact with her. "We have to help her." I started for the tent zipper. Trevor grabbed my arm. "No, look at her eyes." In the firelight, I could see Sarah's face more clearly. Her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, from lid to lid, as if someone had filled them with ink. "That's not Sarah," Trevor whispered. The creature completed its circuit around the fire and sat down across from the Sarah thing. They stared at each other in perfect silence for what felt like hours. "When did it happen?" Jennifer asked quietly. "When did whatever that is replace her?" I tried to remember. Sarah had been with us when we discovered our campsite rebuilt. She'd cried when we'd realized we were trapped. She'd sat with us around the fire all evening. But thinking back, I couldn't remember her saying anything after the voices had started calling our names. She'd been present, but silent. The voices, I realized, when they were calling to us. I don't think Sarah ever answered. We spent the night huddled in the tent, watching the two figures sitting motionless by the fire. Neither moved, neither spoke. They just sat there, staring at each other, while we tried to figure out what had happened to our friend and what we were going to do about it. Dawn came with the same unnatural suddenness as the day before. When the gray light filtered through our tent walls, both figures were gone. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, and there was no sign that Sarah or the creature had ever been there. "Maybe she got away," Jennifer suggested hopefully. "Maybe she ran when the sun came up." We searched the campsite thoroughly, calling Sarah's name. Her tent was still set up, her gear still neatly organized inside, but there was no trace of her. No footprints leading away from camp, no signs of a struggle. It was like she had simply vanished. "We have to try again," Trevor said, shouldering his pack. "We have to find a way out of here." But our hiking attempts proved just as fruitless as the day before. Every direction led us back to Blackwater Creek. Every trail circled back to the clearing. The GPS showed us as a lonely dot in an impossible void, and our phones remained stubbornly without signal. By mid-afternoon, we'd accepted the horrifying truth. We weren't leaving. "Something doesn't want us to go," Jennifer said as we sat by the reformed campfire. We'd stopped questioning how it kept returning to its perfect stone circle configuration. And it took Sarah. "Sarah's not dead," I insisted, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "The thing last night, whatever it was, it looked like her." "It looked like something wearing her face," Trevor corrected grimly. That evening, we decided not to build a fire. If the light was attracting these things, maybe darkness would hide us. We sat in the black night, holding hands so we wouldn't lose each other, listening to the sounds of the forest. The voices came back around 9, as we'd expected, but this time, they included a new one. "Michael, Trevor, Jennifer," Sarah's voice calling from somewhere in the darkness. "Where are you guys? I'm lost. I can't find the camp." The imitation was perfect. If I hadn't seen what had happened to her, I would have run toward the sound immediately. "Help me," the Sarah voice pleaded. "I'm scared. Something's out here with me." Jennifer squeezed my hand tighter. "Don't listen," she whispered. But the voice was so convincing, so desperate. Even knowing what I knew, my body tensed with the urge to respond. "Please," the voice sobbed. "I can see your light. Why won't you answer me?" We weren't using any light. We'd decided to remain in complete darkness. The sobbing continued for another hour before fading away. When it stopped, we heard different sounds. The heavy footsteps from the night before, but multiple sets this time. And something else. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. "How many of them are there?" Jennifer whispered. We didn't find out that night. The sounds circled our campsite endlessly, but nothing approached close enough to see. When dawn came, we were exhausted, hungry, and running low on water. "We need to think about this differently," Trevor announced over our meager breakfast of granola bars and the last of our bottled water. "This place, whatever it is, it's not following normal rules. We need to approach it like a puzzle." "What kind of puzzle traps people and steals their faces?" I demanded. "I don't know, but traditional methods aren't working. We've tried every direction, followed every landmark. Maybe we need to try something counterintuitive." Jennifer perked up. "Like what?" Trevor pointed at Blackwater Creek. "The water disappears into the ground upstream and downstream. What if we followed it under the ground?" "You want us to what, exactly?" "The karst topology," Trevor explained excitedly. "This whole region is full of caves. What if the way out isn't through the forest, but underground?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You want us to go cave diving? With no equipment? In a place where our friend was just replaced by some kind of shape-shifting monster? It's better than sitting here waiting to die." He had a point. We were already down to emergency rations, and finding water was becoming a serious concern. If we stayed in the clearing, we'd either starve or whatever was hunting us would eventually get tired of playing games. We spent the morning exploring the creek more carefully. About half a mile upstream from our camp, we found what Trevor was looking for. A place where the water disappeared under a rocky overhang, creating a pool deep enough to potentially swim through. "This is insane," Jennifer muttered, but she was already stripping down to her underwear. The water was shockingly cold and so dark we couldn't see more than a few inches below the surface. I went first, taking a deep breath and diving down to explore the underwater passage. The opening was narrow but navigable, extending about 15 feet before opening into a larger space. I surfaced in complete darkness, gasping in air that smelled of minerals and dampness. "It's a cave," I called back, my voice echoing off unseen walls. "Pretty big, I think." One by one, the others swam through. We used our dying phones as flashlights, the LED lights revealing a cavern roughly the size of a basketball court. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like teeth, and several passages led off into deeper darkness. "Which way?" Jennifer asked. Trevor consulted his compass. "South. If we can maintain direction underground, maybe we can bypass whatever's keeping us trapped up there." The cave system was larger than we'd anticipated. We'd been walking for over an hour, following a relatively straight passage that seemed to maintain a slight downward slope, when Trevor's phone finally died. "Mine's at 5%, Jennifer reported. "Save it," I said. "We'll navigate by touch if we have to." In the growing darkness, our footsteps echoed strangely off the cave walls. Sometimes the echoes seemed to take too long to return, suggesting vast spaces just beyond our limited vision. Other times, they seemed to come back too quickly, as if the walls were pressing closer than they appeared. We'd been walking in near-total darkness for what felt like another hour when Jennifer stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" In the distance, barely audible over our own breathing and footsteps, came the sound of voices. Human voices, having what sounded like a normal conversation. "Other cavers?" Trevor suggested hopefully. We crept forward, using Jennifer's phone sparingly for navigation. The voices grew louder as we approached, though we still couldn't make out individual words. The passage opened into another large cavern, and Jennifer clicked on her phone to survey the space. 3 people sat around a small fire near the center of the chamber. As our light swept over them, they looked up and waved. "Thank God," one of them called. "We thought we were the only ones down here." They appeared to be cavers, a man and 2 women, equipped with proper helmets, lights, and gear. They looked tired but not distressed, and their fire was burning cheerfully. "How long have you been down here?" the man asked as we approached. "Just a few hours," Trevor replied. "We're trying to find a way out of the forest up top. We got turned around." The cavers exchanged glances. "Turned around how?" one of the women asked. We told them about our experience, the camping trip, the strange sounds, getting lost. We didn't mention Sarah or the creature. It sounded insane enough without those details. "That's strange," the man said. "We came down through a different entrance about 10 miles south of here. Been exploring this system for 3 days." "You know a way out?" Jennifer asked eagerly. "Sure. The entrance we used is about 2 hours' walk through that passage." He pointed to a tunnel on the far side of the chamber. "Though you'll want to be careful. Some of the formations are pretty delicate." Relief flooded through me. Real people with real knowledge of the cave system. A way out that didn't involve the cursed forest above. "Is there anything you need?" the second woman asked. "Food? Water? We've got plenty." We gratefully accepted bottles of water and energy bars. The food tasted better than anything I'd eaten in days, and the water was clean and cold. "So, what brings you down here?" Trevor asked. "Research. Recreation, mostly," the man replied, "though this system has some interesting features. Some of the chambers seem to, well, you'll think we're crazy." "Try us," I said. "Some of the chambers seem to rearrange themselves. We've mapped the same passage 3 different ways, and each time the layout was completely different." Jennifer and I exchanged glances. "That does sound crazy," she said carefully. "Probably just disorientation," the first woman added quickly. "Easy to get turned around in a place like this." We talked for another half hour, sharing stories about caving and hiking. They seemed like perfectly normal outdoor enthusiasts, experienced and knowledgeable. I was starting to feel genuinely optimistic about our chances of escape. "We should probably get going," Trevor eventually said. "Don't want to get caught down here after dark." "Dark's not really an issue in a cave," the man laughed. "But you're right, it's best to keep moving. The entrance passage is pretty straightforward. Just follow the main tunnel and take the left fork when it splits." We thanked them profusely and gathered our gear. As we prepared to leave, the second woman called after us. "Oh, if you run into Sarah, tell her we're sorry we couldn't help." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What did you say?" "Sarah," the woman repeated. "Your friend. She came through here a few hours ago, looking for you. We told her which way you'd gone, but she seemed confused." "What did she look like?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Blonde hair, about 5'6". Pretty girl, but something seemed off about her. She kept asking the same questions over and over, like she couldn't remember the answers. Trevor grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." We hurried toward the passage the cavers had indicated, but as we reached the tunnel entrance, I looked back. The 3 figures were still sitting around their fire, but something was wrong with the scene. The fire was burning without any visible fuel. No wood, no kindling, just flames floating above the ground. And the 3 cavers were sitting perfectly still, not moving at all. Even from a distance, I could see that their eyes were black holes in their faces. "Run," I whispered. We plunged into the tunnel, using the last of Jennifer's phone battery to navigate. Behind us, I could hear the sound of movement, not footsteps, but something like dragging or scraping, as if the 3 figures had stood up but weren't walking normally. The passage seemed to go on forever. We ran blindly through the darkness, bouncing off walls and stumbling over uneven ground. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but the sounds behind us kept us moving. After what felt like hours, we saw light ahead. Real light, gray and natural, filtering down from above. "The entrance," Trevor gasped. We scrambled up a steep incline toward an opening in the ceiling. Fresh air and the sound of wind through trees reached us from above. I'd never been so happy to see overcast sky in my life. One by one, we climbed out of the cave system. We were standing in a forest, but not the same forest we'd entered. The trees were different, pine instead of hardwood, and much younger. There was no sign of Blackwater Creek or the clearing where we'd camped. "Where are we?" Jennifer asked. Trevor checked his phone. Miraculously, it had enough battery for one GPS reading. "About 15 miles south of where we started," he said, staring at the screen in disbelief. "We're near the Ohio border." We were on a marked trail, clean, well-maintained with regular distance markers. After walking for less than an hour, we reached a parking area where a family was loading camping gear into their SUV. "Excuse me," I called to them. "What day is it?" The father looked at us strangely. We probably looked like hell, dirty, exhausted, and wild-eyed. "Sunday," he said, "October 15th. We'd entered the forest on Friday. Somehow, we'd lost only 2 days, though it felt like we'd been trapped for weeks." "Can you give us a ride to the nearest town?" Trevor asked. "We've had car trouble." The family was kind enough to drive us to a small community called English, where we called Trevor's brother to come pick us up. We told him we'd had GPS problems and gotten lost, which was true enough. On the drive back to Indianapolis, we didn't talk about what had happened. We couldn't talk about it. How do you explain something like that to people who've never experienced it? We never reported Sarah missing. How could we? She'd been replaced by something wearing her face, but we had no proof, no evidence, no body. We never went camping together again. I moved to Chicago 6 months later, taking a job I'd been offered but had previously declined. Jennifer transferred to her company's Portland office. Trevor joined the Peace Corps and spent 2 years in Guatemala. We stayed in touch through email and occasional phone calls, but we never talked about that October weekend. We never talked about Sarah. It was as if we'd all agreed, without discussing it, that the safest approach was to pretend it had never happened. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, there's just breathing on the other end. Slow, labored breathing that sounds like it's coming from very far away. And sometimes when I'm walking alone in the city, I catch a glimpse of someone in my peripheral vision. Someone tall and thin, with movements that are just slightly wrong. When I turn to look, there's never anyone there. Last week, I got a friend request on social media from Sarah Robinson. The profile picture shows a blonde woman who looks exactly like my college friend, but when I study the photo closely, the eyes are completely black. I haven't accepted the request. I've been thinking about moving again. Maybe somewhere far from forests. Maybe somewhere with lots of people and bright lights, where things like wendigos can't hide in the darkness between trees. But I'm starting to think it doesn't matter where I go. Some things, once they've noticed you, never stop hunting. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can smell that sour, organic odor that reminds me of death and decay and something fundamentally wrong with the world. I think it's getting closer.